This is Thomas Wayne Riley, and you have found yourself in the American Southwest. This is the second episode in the paid subscriber-only series over Tom Horn. I am making this one free for all listeners, though. Not only to entice you to sign up, but also because it's a nice addition and end to the broader Apache series, which I put on pause last summer. This episode essentially begins where the Apache series left off, minus Victorio's war, and it covers Geronimo's escape and Crook's invasion of Mexico. Obviously, Tom Horn plays a significant role since this is his series, but also Mickey Free, the aforementioned General Crook, Geronimo, Al Sieber, and a ton of players return in this episode, including the Apache Kid, whom I have done an entire series on for paid subscribers already. I hope you enjoy this little addendum to the Apache series, and I hope you enjoy it enough to sign up to become a paid Roadrunner subscriber. Without further ado, things sure do look like war. This episode is graciously sponsored by one of my new favorite companies, the Buffalo Wool Co. Y'all know I have great love and respect for America's national mammal, the bison. My very first episode was over the wild and woolly beast, so when I tell you I discovered a company that makes 100% bison wool products, 100% in America, you know how excited I got. The Buffalo Wool Co. makes the most incredible and comfortable socks you've ever worn. Not only are the Buffalo Wool Co. socks comfortable, but they are warm. You can wear them in the house, to bed, or on a hike. I wore mine in the sands of Great Sand Dunes National Park, and I've worn my Buffalo Wool Co. socks while hunting in the northern forests of Wisconsin. I plan on wearing them for the rest of my life. Buffalo Wool Co. 100% guarantees you will love the product or your money back. The owners of Buffalo Wool Co. have been raising bison in North Texas for almost 30 years, and they're even more passionate about the amazing animals than I am. Buffalo Wool Co. not only makes socks, but also knit caps, gloves, scarves, and extremely warm and comfortable clothing for kids. My wife and I have a little one on the way, and I will absolutely be keeping our kids snug and warm with the Buffalo Wool Co.'s expanding brand. If you like being comfortable and warm and looking awesome while doing it, and if you support 100% made in America clothing, by people who are passionate about these animals and the ranchers who raise them, you will love the Buffalo Wool Co. Head over to their website, thebuffalowoolco.com, or my website, theamericansouthwest.com, where there will be a link on the home page. That's thebuffalowoolco.com. The people pine for dead Indians. An anonymous letter printed in the Arizona Weekly Miner in May of 1885. By early 1885, the hero of our story, Tom Horn, he had been in Arizona for nearly 5 years, and the whole time he'd been witnessing and taking part in the Apache Wars. A lot of that time was spent with or near Al Sieber. Some of that time he was prospecting. Most of the time he was working for the Army or the San Carlos Reservation, in some such capacity as a civilian. He'd seen a lot in that small span of half a decade, and he never wanted to leave Arizona or the excitement it gave him. And then The excitement ramped up in May of 1885 when a 63-year-old man, I only talked about briefly in my Apache series, a man, of course, named Geronimo. In May of 85, he'd flee the reservation with over 100 of his warrior friends and family, and they'd head for Mexico, and they'd leave a bloody trail of carnage and senseless and sad death in his wake. At around this time, Horn was more than willing to go hunt down Apaches, or really any Indians. He and a buddy had recently started their own ranch with 100 heads of cattle and 26 horses. But before long, quote, "The Indians and Mexicans cleaned me out and left me dead broke," end quote. He and his friend even ran down some of the thieves at one point, but this unfortunately got his friend killed and he himself injured. So only a few days after hearing that Geronimo had sprang for Mexico, Horn was back with the pack muler Long Jim Cook. But almost immediately, Al Sieber personally tapped Horn as his man, as his chief of scouts, for this trip to retrieve the wayward medicine man. But even before this escape of Geronimo, Al Sieber and Tom Horn had been on a few adventures at the reservation. On one such occasion, when Al Sieber was actually sober, he learned that an old Apache man named Centipede was brewing their favorite drink. And what is their favorite drink? Tizwin. If you'll remember, General Crook had forbade the Apaches from brewing or drinking Tizwin. Oh, and also he forbade them from beating their wives and cutting off their noses. So Sieber and Tom Horn went to investigate on one of Sieber's many Tizwin raids. And I may have actually told this story in the Apache Kids series, but I'll tell it again. Or rather, I'll let Paul Andrew Hutton from his incredible book, The Apache Wars, describe what happens next. Quote, "Sieber and Horn surprise an old Apache called Centipede in the act of preparing a potent pot of home brew. Centipede, as tough as Sieber, called the scout a quote-unquote meddlesome old squaw and went for his rifle. Before the Apache could grab his gun, Sieber had him by the hair, and to Horn's surprise, quoting Horn now, made one swipe at him with his knife which nearly cut his head off." End quote. Sieber then stuffed the dead Apache into the large Tizwin brew pot. He ordered the Apache women, who were helping the brewmaster, to tell everyone what had happened and, quote, that they had better leave off making that stuff. End all quotes. It's incidents like these that help explain how Horn became so violent later in life. As one man who knew him would later say, quote, "By custom and habit, had the idea baked into his very soul that there was nothing wrong in killing renegade thieves." End quote. Sieber and the quote-unquote savage Apache warriors, according to this man named Jim King, Sieber and the savage Apaches were Horn's tutors in the art of violence. And violence was coming. On May 15th, 1885, the military leader of the San Carlos Reservation awoke to find, according to Hutton, quote, all the Chiricahua leaders waiting for him. Geronimo, Naiche, and Chihuahua were still so drunk from a Tizwin party the night before that they could barely stand. Loco, Nana, and Benito were hungover but upright. 24 warriors, some of them armed, milled around behind their leaders. End quote. These Apaches were angry at the prohibition of Tizwin and the prohibition of wife-beating, and they wanted a meeting with the head of the White Eyes. The night before, Geronimo had thrown a huge fandango of a Tizwin bender. 75%, around 90 Chiricahuas men, including all of the leaders, except a man named Chato, they all arrived at this planned party. Geronimo told everyone, "Tomorrow, as we recover, we will confront Lieutenant Davis," the head of the res, and we will tell him we are fed up with this prohibition against Tiswin. Geronimo even suggested they can't arrest us all on account of the calaboose not being big enough. So that is just what they did. They all got drunk, and then they all confronted Lieutenant Davis. Loco did the talking as he squatted on the floor of Davis's tent, and Mickey Free interpreted. But quick aside about Mickey Free. If you'll recall from the Apache series, Mickey Free was the one-eyed, mean-mugging half-breed who had been kidnapped, and whose kidnapping led to the cutting of the tent and the war with Cochise and Mangus Colorados against the American government. And this war continued against the rebels during the brief Confederate territory of Arizona, which this war gave Baylor so much trouble. I ended the Apache series early, but the next 2 episodes I was going to do was about Victorio and Nana, and then Mickey Free and Geronimo. But I had had enough talk of Apaches, so I moved on to the Civil War, where I got to talk about the Apaches. And for y'all subscribers, I wanted to do a Tom Horn series, so I now get to talk about the Apaches. It's hard to talk about the Southwest, especially during this time, without talking about these storied and marshaled people. Mickey Free, if you'll recall, was hated by the Apaches, who called him the Coyote. He was a scout for the Army, and that didn't help. He was of mixed race. He could not be trusted by either side. Geronimo on multiple occasions even thought that Mickey Free would assassinate him at the reservation. Mickey Free was no fan of Geronimo, and Geronimo, according to Paul Andrew Hutton in the Apache Wars, quote, Geronimo now blamed Mickey Free for every bad tale told about him. End quote. So we've got all these angry Apache leaders and warriors and medicine men. And Loco is talking. He's talking for a long time. But Chihuahua, who was, quote, palpably drunk and in an ugly humor, end quote. He had had enough of Loco's slow, meandering speech, so he interrupted. Chihuahua then berates the whites, not only for drinking while off duty, but even while on duty. And all the while, the whites were simultaneously barring the Apaches from drinking at all. He also said the white man had no business in what an Apache man does in his home to his wife. Chihuahua said, quote, they were not children to be taught how to live with their women and what they should eat or drink. The treatment of their wives was their own business. They were not ill-treated when they behaved. End quote. When they behaved being the key word there. Lieutenant Davis responded with his own lecture against the evils of drinking and wife-beating. But Nana, the old chief, he interrupted again with some harsh Apache words. And then he slinked off. Lieutenant Davis naturally asked Mickey Free what he had just said, Nana. But Mickey avoided answering. That is, until Davis forced him to. And Mickey Free told Lieutenant Davis that Nana essentially said, quote, tell the Nantan Inchan that he can't advise me how to treat my woman. He is only a boy. I killed men before he was born. End quote. Chihuahua then added essentially, we drank Tiswin last night. What are you going to do about it? Put us all in jail? You can't fit us all in that little jail. Davis responded with, I just might. But let me send a telegram to Nantan Lupin, Captain Grey Wolf, General Crook. Let me ask him what he wants to do. After that, the Apaches dispersed. Crook, though, he never received that telegram. Davis sent it to a new man in the field, a New York man from the war named Captain Pierce. He had fought Rebs, but he'd never dealt with Apaches before. He was brand new. Naturally, he was confused by the telegram, so he awoke his trusted head of scouts, Al Sieber, and asked him what the heck was going on. Of course, Sieber had been up all night gambling and drinking, so he was hungover and sleeping it off, and he wanted nothing to do with Apaches at the moment. So he told Pierce, quote, "It's nothing but a tiswin, drunk. Don't pay any attention to it." End quote. Davis had no idea that his message was ignored, and as the days trickled by, he began to get a little worried. Davis was not a fan of Geronimo. Few Anglos were a fan of Geronimo, honestly. Davis said of Geronimo that he was, quote, "thoroughly vicious, intractable, and treacherous man. His only redeeming qualities were courage and determination. His word, no matter how earnestly pledged, was worthless. His history was a series of broken pledges and incitements to outbreaks." End quote. How right he was, as you're about to hear. Geronimo and the Apaches, they were worrying far more than Davis, and they grew increasingly paranoid. Over the coming days, their imagination ran wild with how they imagined Davis, whom they didn't like, and Crook, whom they respected. They were imagining what the White Eyes were going to do to them. And then finally, Mangus, the son of Mangus Coloradus, Mangus's wife, who was the chief brewmaster of Tiswin, she gave a rousing speech and called into question the Apache men's bravery. She yelled, quote, "If you are warriors, you will take to the warpath, and then the gray fox must catch you before you are punished." End quote. This speech may have been enough. By the afternoon of the 17th of May, 1885, Geronimo and a bunch of Apaches had cut the telegraph line and had fled the reservation with 42 men and 92 women and children. Davis would learn of this from Mickey Free as he was umpiring a baseball game. Chihuahua and Mangus Coloradus' son, Mangus, they went into the northern section of the Mogollon Mountains, while Geronimo and Nana went into the southern section. Now, I have talked extensively about this place. I love this place. I have visited it often. I love camping on the Gila River and exploring the cliff dwellings or walking along the catwalk recreation area. Geronimo himself was born near the headwaters of the Gila River. It is a place I love, and it is a place Geronimo and these Chiricahua Apaches knew well. Immediately after the telegraph lines were fixed and he heard the news, Crook sent around 80 men and a few scouts in hot pursuit of the hostiles, the renegade hostiles. But these few men were not very successful. At this time, though, Horn and an Apache scout named Spike, they were sent to retrieve Nana, who was with Geronimo. They would not get very far, though, and many of the men were recalled, actually all of them were recalled, after the forest fires the Apaches set made it hard to pursue them. Impossible, really. Davis realized he did not have enough men to round up 144, which was the final tally of the Apaches that left. He did not have enough men. He was going to need a bigger boat. Not to get too far into it, but once in these mountains, Chihuahua realized he had been duped by Geronimo into leaving the reservation in the first place. And when he learned this, Chihuahua went to go kill Geronimo. He figured, well, if I go kill the old drunk, that'll give me some leeway with Crook. But Geronimo learned of this, and he fled east towards the Black Range. this division would not heal during the duration of the war, although Chihuahua would never get to kill Geronimo. This entire time that Geronimo and the Apaches were fleeing, they killed every White Eyes and Mexican they came across. They slaughtered and mutilated entire families in eastern Arizona and western New Mexico. Just a few miles north of Silver City, between Pinos Altos and that town of Silver City, Geronimo and his thugs killed 2 entire families, including their young children and infants. They also hung a teenage girl from a meat hook in their barn, and she would not survive her injuries. And this and many more examples to come, which I am loath to repeat, they are why I had to quit the Apache Series when I did. As I began to study and read for future episodes, including these very stories, I realized the depredations were ceaseless and the violence was ugly. I'm probably not as strong as other history podcasters like Dan Carlin and Daryl Cooper, who can somehow go on and on about atrocities. But they eventually get to me. So I moved on. Especially since I have a child on the way in just a few weeks. It's hard to read about this stuff now, let alone write it and then talk about it. But I guess I'm back now. One Lieutenant Parker, who was in pursuit, he got very sick of burying the dead that littered the Apache's trail. He would later say of stacking rocks on top of the corpses, quote, "We became very expert in the business." End quote. This same Lieutenant Parker would get into a heated shootout in the Mogollon Mountains at a place known as Devil's Canyon. His superior officer, a Captain Smith, he walked the entire troop and their scouts into an ambush. And the ambush began while Smith was bathing. Lieutenant Parker, though, he knew better, and so did his scouts. So when Geronimo, Mangus, and Naiche sprang the trap, they were ready. Parker, only months before, had been out hunting with Geronimo, and now the man was trying to kill him. Parker raced up the side of the canyon with 17 troopers in tow. And all the while he was being shot at by the Apaches up top and the other troopers, his fellow soldiers, from below in the canyon. It took him half an hour to scale the walls, and once he got to the top, Geronimo and his warriors fled the scene. 2 troopers and 1 scout had been injured. In Edwin Sweeney's tome, it's an enormous book, just like his other book over Mangus Coloradus. But in Edwin Sweeney's book, From Cochise to Geronimo, he writes at the end of the battle and says that Smith had arrived at the top of the canyon after some time, quote, dressed in his drawers and boots. For this, the Silver City Enterprise sarcastically dubbed the fight the Battle of the Shirt Tail. End quote. On June 8th, a Captain Lawton of the 4th Cavalry, along with 7 troopers and a few scouts, as well as, importantly, wagons loaded with 40 days' worth of rations and up to 10,000 rounds of ammunition. Captain Lawton and a scout, they went to look for the Apaches in the mountains of southwest New Mexico. Unfortunately, while he was gone, his sergeant and the troopers and all that ammo and all them rations, they were attacked. Chihuahua himself started the ambush when he shot a private in the forehead. The soldiers, who were just eating lunch, were so startled and confused at first, they thought the private had shot himself. But then the quote-unquote thunderous volley rained down upon him. Their sergeant would take 4 bullets. He would not survive. And another private would be killed as he retreated. Eventually, the wagons caught fire and some of the ammo began to explode. The troopers used this diversion and fled the hour-long ambush. Chihuahua then ran south and headed to Mexico with all the rations, animals, and ammo they could carry. And then the entire lot of them crossed the border. Captain Lawton will feature heavily in the final capture of Geronimo. The past few weeks after the breakout had cost the lives of over 20 Americans and Mexicans in the Southwest. But the war was only just beginning, and those numbers will rise. Naturally, the New Mexican press began to call for the complete extermination of the Apaches, and they dismissed Crook's plan of appeasement and his use of Apache Scouts completely. I mean, the Southwesterners had done that since Crook had first arrived. As soon as Crook found out about the escape, he sent word to Sonora and Chihuahua. He sent word to Washington, and he secured the border in case the Apache tried to return. Crook sent men to man every watering hole. He then had a second line of protection further north from the border and the watering holes, and still a third line of protection that manned the railroad. He wasn't taking any chances. But even all of this was not enough. He knew ultimately he would have to send a force into Old Mexico and capture or kill these renegade Apaches. He then set about organizing 2 separate columns to pursue Geronimo and his thugs into Mexico. One important Chiricahua Apache Scout leader was a man named Chato. I mentioned him earlier. He had not participated in the Tiz Wind drunk, and he had been on guard with Mickey Free when Geronimo and his men came in with everyone to complain about the prohibition. Chato was a trusted Apache, although he had been with Cochise during those many years. Cochise had, after all, been his chief. Chato was a cousin of Mangus the Younger, and he had grown up with them. But now he was on the side of the White Eyes for the protection of his people. Chato was also said to have had great medicine. Medicine he claimed he got from his dreams, which foretold the future. Oh, and also from muscle spasms, which warned him of imminent danger. Chato will play an important role in the coming battle. But so will Tom Horn. On this trip into Mexico in hot pursuit of Geronimo, opposed to the trips in the previous episode where Horn had said he was a scout, but he was really just a mule-pack train man. For this pursuit, Horn really was a scout with Al Sieber and Mickey Free, and most likely, the Apache Kid. So, Al Sieber, the German whose family were 48ers, Mickey Free, the mixed blood scout, the future renegade and most feared Apache of all time, the Apache Kid, and Tom Horn were all sent with a Captain Emmett Crawford. Emmett Crawford had just been relieved from Arizona, and at this time he was in Texas, at the time of all these violent shenanigans. But Crook needed him, and he recalled him to Arizona, and the tall, sad, handsome 42-year-old who was not known to laugh aloud, he dutifully joined. Lieutenant Davis, who had taken his place, he was glad to have Crawford back. He said of the man that he would have been, quote, an ideal knight of King Arthur's court, end quote. Davis also said of Crawford, quote, his expressed wish was that he might die in the act of saving the lives of others, end quote. On June 11th, Crawford crossed the desert boundary with Mexico and entered Sonora with his scouts and Tom Horn. Horn would write, quote, things sure do look like war, end quote. Immediately during this excursion, the going was rough in northern Mexico. And honestly, Sieber wasn't helping. After some Apache Scouts killed a bear, which is a thing I thought the Apache avoided since they thought they could be reborn as a bear, but apparently some Apache Scouts killed a bear. Sieber skinned it, and then from what I can tell, he either wore or carried the skin right into the pack of mules, which spooked the creature so bad that it took an hour to round them up. Horn would write that after Al scared him, quote, the plain was full of brawling, crazed mules running in every direction, end quote. On top of the pranks, the Apache just could not help themselves, and they were constantly drunk. A theme that will run throughout this episode. Eventually, Mexican ranchers mistook two hungover Apache Scouts, who were lagging behind. These Mexicans mistook them for the renegade Apaches and shot them, which resulted in one of them actually dying. Chato, Lieutenant Davis, and Sieber calmed down the Apaches who had dressed down for battle, meaning they stripped all their clothes off, and they wanted to seek revenge by killing every Mexican they could find. Even though they succeeded in calming the Apache Scouts down, a few scouts did go out and kill 25 heads of cattle in revenge. An action for which these Apache Scouts who killed the cattle, they were discharged and sent back to the States to stand trial. Captain Crawford, not very pleased, then had to compensate the Mexican ranchers. There were also the 16-hour-a-day marches in temperatures that soared to 128 degrees. And this is all through impossible country filled with thorns, spikes, venomous animals, cliffs, and canyons. Many a mule toppled over the edge of these cliffs. At this time, the state of Sonora had their own problems. The governor of Sonora had actually petitioned Papa Diaz and DF to send help against this new Apache threat, as if it were new. But the governor Torres, he petitioned Papa Diaz for help from this new threat. But he got no response. So Governor Torres would tell the leaders of the towns that they were on their own. The state was, at that very moment, fighting against the Yaquis and Mayo in southern Sonora, and the state really could not help. Governor Torres wrote that until the fight was done in the south, the leaders in the north of Sonora would have to, quote, rely on the patriotism of his own people, end quote. But then the governor suggested that they bill the governor for any expenses incurred during the campaign. So the Americans and the Apache Scouts were going it mostly alone in northern Mexico. Although, as you'll hear, not for the duration of this campaign. On June 22nd, Sieber, Lieutenant Davis, and Captain Crawford heard of a band of renegade Apaches hiding north of a town called Oputo. So they fatefully sent Chato the Apache and his scouts with no white officers or soldiers to go get them. Chato and his 30 scouts, though, after a blinding rainstorm, they discovered Chihuahua's camp in the foothills of the Sierra Madres. After surrounding the camp, Chato opened fire. The renegade Apaches only had time to flee, and during the fleeing, Chihuahua hid the women and children in a cave while the warriors tried to draw Chato and the scouts away, but they were ultimately unsuccessful. Eventually, those not dead or wounded or hiding, they all fled. Chato and his scouts would capture 15 women and children, including all of Chihuahua's family. They also killed an old woman and one male warrior. The 3 leaders of the expedition blamed themselves for not going with Chato and capturing Chihuahua. So the problem was, Chato had gone on raids with Cochise into the states of Sonora and Chihuahua. And during those raids, Chato and Cochise had killed and looted from many a Mexican. So Chato was leery of going into Mexican towns and asking for information. During the march from Arizona, in this campaign, Chato had even been stopped a few times and recognized by Mexicans and Mexican officials. Lieutenant Davis would record that in the town of Aputo, quote, every family had lost one or more male members at the hands of the Apache. End quote. Had Chato been among the murderers? The leaders of the expedition, meaning Crawford and Davis and Sieber, they felt that Chato's hesitation had cost the Americans a decisive victory against Chihuahua. But Chato hadn't failed completely. He had recovered the wagons of rations and ammo that Lawton had lost, and he had captured all of Chihuahua's family, which would ultimately prove fruitful. Crawford then sent a woman to Chihuahua with a message. Either surrender or kill Geronimo. Only then will you get your family back. Although Chihuahua was furious at Geronimo and still wanting to kill him, the taking of his family by Chato only enraged him against that man whom he now vowed to kill. Most of the captured Apaches were sent north to Fort Bowie in Arizona, including Chihuahua's family. And once there, a special jail was built for all of them. Crook now hoped news of Chihuahua's family's imprisonment would lure the renegade Apache back to Arizona. The other column of Americans was led by a different Davis from Lieutenant Davis and Captain Crawford. It was a Captain Wirt Davis. Although he was a Virginian, Wirt had enlisted as a Yankee during the Civil War. And it was a war which he earned many accolades in, and a war which he was promoted regularly in. He was a good soldier, but he was a hard drinker, and he was also a crack shot with his guns. He'd fought hard against the Rebs, and he'd fought hard against the Indians on the northern plains. Sweeney describes him thusly, quote, at 5 feet 10 inches, with a handlebar mustache and hair now more gray than blonde, he looked more like a gentle-hearted grandfather than a veteran Indian fighter. End quote. Like Crook, Wirt Davis trusted his Apache Scouts, and during this war against Geronimo, he will be an incredibly important figure. His column would cross into Mexico in July. Also in July, Geronimo, Mangus, and Naiche began raiding towns at the base of the Sierra Madres. They killed Mexicans, they killed horses, and they stole a lot of cattle. Fed up with this, a Captain Leonardo Gomez and 150 Mexican national troops went in hot pursuit. And this pursuit spooked Geronimo and his men, and it forced them to split up. Mangus took a group east, Naiche took a group north and would soon meet up with Chihuahua, and Geronimo, with most of the women and children, went northeast. By now, it was not just the Americans and Mexicans the Apaches were afraid of. They also feared the Apache Scouts, who they knew many personally. And they also feared the Tarahumara or Raramuri. These people are the probable descendants of the Anasazi, and these people lived in the deep canyons and high mountains of the Sierras. The Tarahumara were no friend to the Apaches, whom they may have fled from half a millennia before. And I have talked about that previously, and I will talk about that again soon. So, Geronimo and his people had to stay on the move, and they couldn't leave their women and children behind. They just knew either the Apache Scouts or the Raramuri, a.k.a. Tarahumara, would find them. They couldn't leave them in their mountain strongholds for long. In desperation, it was not too much time before the Apaches began again to raid the slopes of the Mother Mountains. On July 23rd, Captain Wirt Davis and his men found and encircled a camp of Geronimo and Mangus. The two had since reconnected. When the Americans and Apache Scouts sprang the trap, though, they realized the camp was empty. Oh, but they had been close. The night before, at Geronimo's camp, an older Apache woman had warned Geronimo that they could not stay in this encampment any longer. Her medicine had told her they needed to leave. While Geronimo dismissed it, the rest of his people heeded her warning, and the camp promptly left. She had been right. Her medicine had been strong. What Wirt Davis and his men needed now were their own medicine. So Wirt Davis himself asked the Apaches to use their power, their medicine, to find out where Geronimo had gone. Only one man, one Chiricahua man, a man named Gushigu, he agreed to help. And I will let Sweeney describe the unbelievable scene. It's just hard to believe an Anglo would ask for Apache medicine, but it's a very cool story. Quote, Davis requested that a medicine man conduct a ceremony to figure out where Geronimo had gone. Only one Apache, Gushigu, consented to use his power. His specialty was healing the sick, but he told Captain Davis that his power was omnipotent. Quote, I can tell all things, end quote, he confidently proclaimed. The Apaches, quote-unquote, tied up 4 drums, or 4 buckets provided by the soldiers, for the ceremony. That night, the officers attended the service. All the scouts helped the medicine man sing. Around midnight, his power began to talk to him. He went into a detailed litany of the daily movements of the hostiles and what the scouts would find. He said that Geronimo's followers had camped at the crest of El Tigre Mountains, quote, on a long, narrow bed, end quote. Then they had moved down toward the Bavispe River, where the women had gathered acorns. From here, they went to a mountain opposite Bugatseca, where they had cooked mezcal. The hostiles had left one large piece of mezcal behind. Gushigu said that if the scouts found this piece of mezcal, then, quote-unquote, all will be good. At Geronimo's camp, he said, they would see a yellow mule. Then the scouts would attack the village at Bugatseca, killing a few and capturing many women and children. End all quotes. As it turns out, Gushigu's medicine seems to have been strong. On August 7th, Wirt Davis sent Lieutenant Day and a White Mountain Apache scout named Bilas, along with 15 men, in search of Geronimo's camp at the base of Bugatseca Mountain, which is the same mountain the medicine man had predicted they'd be at. As Lieutenant Day and Bilas surrounded the camp, though, a mule, not sure if it was yellow or not, but a mule noticed the intruders and made a call, and this call alerted Geronimo's camp. With the element of surprise gone, and before they could surround the camp, Bilas had to open fire. Despite Geronimo being shot at by nearly everyone, and despite Geronimo holding his infant son at this time, the medicine man got away. He did leave his son behind, though, alive. When the scouts saw him drop the child as he ran, they assumed they had hit Geronimo. But that was not the case. Although many escaped, in the end, 15 women and children, including Geronimo's 3 wives and 5 children, they had all been captured. Unfortunately, 2 women and 1 small child, who took a ricochet to the eye, perished. Later, Lieutenant Day would say, quote, "Every single thing that the medicine man had told us had come true." End quote. While the raid had partially been a success, Geronimo had indeed escaped. So had Nana and Mangus. Nana and 40 survivors were with Geronimo, and they fled southeast towards Chihuahua, the state, not the Chiricahua Apache. Mangus and the few who were with him fled north. Eventually, Lieutenant Day and Bilas and the other scouts, they made their way back to the mule train, where they ran into the leader of the other invading column. They ran into Captain Crawford and his Apache scout, Chato. It's been a while since we've talked about the star of this series, Tom Horn. So let's get into what he was up to. In August of 1885, the same month that Wirt Davis's men ran into Geronimo, Captain Crawford had decided to go across the rough and rugged Sierra Madre to meet up with them, Wirt Davis. Once on the eastern slopes of those grand mountains, Crawford ordered Lieutenant Davis, Al Sieber, Mickey Free, and 32 scouts back down into the dangerous Sierra Madres. Their chase lasted weeks and was quite grueling, through a heavy rain that some scouts believed Geronimo could summon with strong medicine. But if the head chief of scouts, Al Sieber, left, who was now in charge of the scouts that were still there? I'll let Larry Ball and Tom Horn in Life and Legend tell y'all. Quote, "By sending Sieber away, Crawford had, in effect, left his immediate command without a chief of scouts. Since Tom Horn had been assisting Al Sieber, he became an acting chief of scouts by default and assumed responsibility for the scouts remaining with Crawford." End quote. So finally, Tom Horn became chief of scouts. Despite what he says in his autobiography, this is indeed the first instance where this is actually true. Even still, it was quote-unquote acting chief of scouts. This wasn't the first time that Al Sieber had left him with some responsibility, though. Throughout the campaign, Al Sieber would take some scouts and go on side missions to sniff out the enemy, and when he did, he would leave Tom in charge. Sometimes Tom would accompany Al, and other times Tom would be sent out on his own side quests with some scouts. By this time in the conflict, though, Al Sieber felt strongly enough about Tom Horn to let him lead the scouts with Crawford, while Al Sieber had been commanded to go search the mountains. Sieber would later write of Tom, quote, "I ever found Tom true to the last letter of the law to any and every trust confided to his care. End quote. But immediately upon taking command, Tom was presented with the challenging Apache nature when a tiz-winning gambling bender got out of hand. Eventually, the small kerfuffle grew and the Apaches were itching to fight each other. Thankfully, Tom Horn, with some possible Apache tongue mastery, but definitely Spanish, he stepped in with Crawford and disarmed the situation and the drunk men. As Ball says in his book, Tom had passed his first test and had, quote, gained the confidence of his commander and gained the trust of his scouts. End quote. Shortly after taking command, Horn and his scouts had a funny little encounter with an Irish sergeant who was escorting the captured women and children from Geronimo's camp, the camp that Wirt Davis and his scouts had successfully ambushed. I will now read from Larry Ball again, and he will quote Horn's autobiography. Now, who knows with Horn if this story is true to the letter, but it's still a great one. Quote, when this tough Irish sergeant spied Horn and his scouts approaching, Nolan mistook them, Nolan is the Irish sergeant, Nolan mistook them for hostiles and ordered his charges to take cover. Preparing to protect the prisoners with his life, Nolan exclaimed, according to Horn, and now quoting Sergeant Nolan from Horn's autobiography, ladies, there are people approaching that are your friends and are enemies of mine in the United States government. Now I, Sergeant Nolan, do order you to get behind the reef of rocks, and I want you to be damned quick about it and not stand there gaping like a lot of low-down shanty Irish. Here, you little black-haired imp of the devil, let that pack horse go and come along here. To hell with your damn talk, and do you mind? You think that you will be rescued, do you? Not while Nolan is at the wheel. You won't lose your course. I will order a court-martial and hang every mother's son of you to the yardarm. End quote. When a member of Nolan's party finally convinced him that these would-be assailants were actually scouts, he exclaimed, quote, God be praised! I was afraid I would have to take a life, and I was using my best judgment to conduct myself as a gentleman before ladies. End all quotes. Crawford would actually take these women from the Irish sergeant, and he would interrogate them himself with Chatto's help. The story from Edwin Sweeney goes that after a rather easy questioning in which Geronimo's wives said they knew nothing, Crawford grew impatient. He took these Apache women to his tent, drew his pistol on them, pulled back the lever, and asked them again where Geronimo and the Apaches were heading. Here's Sweeney's telling of the rather shocking event. Quote, eager for information, Crawford took custody of Wirt Davis's prisoners. He and Chatto interrogated two of Geronimo's wives, but they knew nothing of Geronimo's immediate plans. They did say that Naiche was in the mountains west of the Sierra Madre. They knew nothing of Chihuahua because they had not seen him since May 19th. Then, according to Chatto, quote, Crawford took the women down to his tent and questioned them all about Geronimo. End quote. They reiterated what they had told Chatto. Crawford then made a move that seemed uncharacteristic of him. He pulled out his revolver and threatened the women. They, quote, were on the verge of tears, but they claimed they did not know anything. End quote. Crawford backed down. This was a sign that the 2 months of exacting duty in Sonora were beginning to wear on Crawford. He knew that Crook needed results, and he was prepared to straddle the line to achieve them. End all quotes. By the end of August, with constant monsoons harassing the men, the two armies had split up yet again. Crawford decided to take his men, which included Tom Horn, and he followed Geronimo's trail. Wirt Davis decided to head to the western side of the Sierra Madres. These guys were basically just crisscrossing the northern section of the Sierra Madres, a dangerous place. On his way to the western edge, Wirt Davis got word from a Mexican general, a man named Diego Guerra, that he and his 366 men were in hot pursuit of the renegade Apache, and Guerra wanted nothing more than to exterminate every last one of them. Men, women, and children. Also, he would like a word with the American captain. On August 27th, Guerra showed up to Davis's camp in all his Hispanic pomp and asked to speak with the commander. Sweeney quotes a man named Hook, and Hook talks about Guerra's arrival, and I want to quote it for y'all. He was all dressed up. He had silver buttons on both sides of his coat and silver eagles on each side of his hat. His saddle was all silver, mounted with big conchos and eagles. His horse had silver eagles on both sides of his bridle also. End quote. There's just nothing like Latin American machismo. But then Guerra's actions further reinforced the Latin American machismo. Apparently, Guerra informed Davis that he had fought with Chihuahua just 2 days before. But unfortunately, Chihuahua and his 12 men, which included 4 teenagers, they had bested the general and his 366 men, and the Apaches had killed 2 before they escaped. So Guerra asked Davis if he could use some of his Apache Scouts. Bailes, the scout who had led the raid on Geronimo not long before, he absolutely refused. He was not going to go with the evil Mexicans, the Mexicans who the Apaches hated even more than the White Eyes, a people they had fought against for centuries. For goodness sakes, Geronimo's own family had been slaughtered in the dead of night by the Mexicans, which is probably what made the man so mean. Outraged, Guerra stormed out and rode away with his men. But imagine being a commander, and you approach a foreign army who is in your land, you outnumber them, but you can't order them to leave or help them tackle your enemy. It goes to show either the weakness of the Mexican forces or the strength of the American. Davis then packed up and left and followed the trail of Chihuahua. And this trail included the site of the battle where Guerra lost 2 men. 2 men they had apparently left behind because this same Hook described the place as stinking like death. In reality, the entire months of July and August and most of September, Chihuahua and his men killed nearly 20 Mexicans and Americans on both sides of the border, and they wounded about a dozen more. Chihuahua wanted to reach his family up in Arizona, so he made his way north, killing whomever he came across, including women and 2 small children. And then in Arizona, he realized the heat was too hot, so he went back again down south into Mexico. And by now, as the General Guerra story suggests, warriors and officials on both sides of the border were hunting down the renegade Apaches with fury. While Davis was hot on his trail, he wasn't fast enough, and Chihuahua and his band, which occasionally included Naiche and his people, the 2 were constantly meeting up and then dividing. But all the while, the Apaches continued their killing and raiding, indiscriminately. Here's another story from Sweeney's From Cochise to Geronimo tome that I'd like to quote from to emphasize the fear and heroics that an Apache attack can elicit. Quote, "On the afternoon of September 18th, 1885, his scouts, meaning Chihuahua's scouts, his scouts spotted a party of 5 Americans who had left Nacozari en route to a mining claim in the Chiricahuas Mountains. They had originally outfitted at Tombstone and were traveling with several burros packed with mining supplies and provisions. Quote, everything that a miner uses in his outfit, end quote. Chihuahua was waiting. Though his opening salvo did no apparent damage, it frightened off 2 men, who abandoned their 3 friends and fled for their lives. That left 2 men and 1 woman to fend off the Chiricahuas. One brave man fired several shots from his Winchester and a few charges from a shotgun before a Chiricahua volley cut him down. Then the woman, Belle Davis, ran over to her companion, unbuckled his cartridge belt, grabbed his Winchester and shotgun, and fired 4 loads of buckshot at the hostiles. She and her husband crawled into shelter behind rocks. Unwilling to approach the 2 entrenched Americans, and anticipating that the 2 who had escaped would bring help, Chihuahua abandoned the fight. End all quotes. There's this fantastic fiction writer named Elmore Leonard, and I have been reading him for over a decade now, but I had no idea he wrote a book until recently about American cavalrymen who went down into Mexico on a secret mission to hunt for Apaches, and that book is called The Bounty Hunters. I loved the show Justified, which he wrote, and the show was based off of his novels. Raylan and Boyd are direct creations of Elmore Leonard, and they're some of the best. But before he wrote about the Miami underworld and the Dixie Mafia, he wrote westerns, including, by the way, 310 to Yuma. But he wrote a book in his early years called The Bounty Hunters, and it is a perfect companion to this Apache series. He writes like how I speak of the Apache. He keeps them real, savage, sorry for that word, but it fits, and human. He shows the ineptness of the U.S. Army against them, the Apaches, while at the same time showing that a few amazing soldiers had the game figured out. He also showed the absolute ineptness and the cowardice of the Mexican forces, many of which in this novel and this episode particularly, and in real life, but many of the Mexican forces were freed prisoners sent up north to fight Apaches. They did not make the best soldiers. Elmore Leonard's great, and you should read that novel, The Bounty Hunters. And no, it isn't anything like Blood Meridian, although the scalp hunters are a main part of the story, but it shows that Americans were heavily involved in northern Mexico at this time, mostly as prospectors, but there were also the Mormons who fled the states to continue polygamy. There were the railroaders, the mercenaries, the bounty hunters. A story like this one about prospectors getting waylaid by renegade Apaches reminds me of the interconnectedness of northern Mexico and the U.S. at this time. It also reminds me of the novel Bounty Hunters. So back to the story. The very next day after that attack against Belle and her husband, Davis and his men and over 100 Apache Scouts made their way to a ranch, which had also just been attacked by Chihuahua. It had been attacked before the Bell-Davis attack. Yeah, there are too many Davises in this episode, for sure. But Belle and her husband mistook this American and Apache Scout force as more of the enemy, so they hid. But the Scouts saw them, motioned in their direction, and spooked Belle and her husband, who began to run. But Wirt Davis called out to them in English and asked them to please come back. Belle and her husband stopped, turned around, and came to their help. By the way, this is how Sweeney describes Belle Davis and her husband. He says, a relieved Belle Davis wearing a cartridge belt and carrying a shotgun in one hand. I mean, that's just an awesome description. You had to be hardy back then. Belle immediately recounted to Wirt Davis the previous day's events, and he sprang into action. They rode to the scene of the crime, buried the dead American, and then took up the trail. Bylas, the Apache Scout, eventually led them to the same mountains where they'd sprang the trap on the empty Geronimo camp a month or so prior. But this time the trail continued higher up into the mountains. The Americans and their scouts followed the trail. Eventually, one of the head scouts realized that they were walking into a trap. But rather than me recount the whole ordeal, I'll sum it up as 100 of Wirt Davis's Western Apache Scouts went up against 25 of Chihuahua and Naiche's Chiricahuas men and women, and these scouts did not put up much of a fight. After hours of shooting back and forth, the fighting lulled and Chihuahua emerged from the rocks to basically brag that they'd already killed one Western Apache Scout. How many more want to die? One of the Apache Scouts, a scout named Longloins, realized that the man yelling was Chihuahua. So he responded with basically, "We are only looking for you. We don't want to fight. We just want to talk." Chihuahua responded with, quote, "All right then, we will go on that bluff there and talk it over." End quote. Longloins was excited to bring in his relative because Chihuahua and Longloins were relatives, and the scout was one of many Apache Scouts that signed on in the hopes of bringing peace instead of violence, which is also why they probably didn't put up much of a fight. But Longloins, I cannot get over that name. His Apache name is Nantiinesen. He asked Davis for a horse, but Davis refused. Davis would not let the Apache go visit his relatives for fear of Chihuahua being duplicitous. And this would turn out to be a huge missed opportunity for the Americans. A missed opportunity which only reinforced in Chihuahua and Naiche's mind that the Americans and their traitorous scouts were only out for war, not peace. In reality, some of the Western Apache Scouts were truly out for war. When Chihuahua had yelled that we had already killed a Western Apache, who else wants to die, he was not lying. After Long Loin's parley was denied, Wirt Davis met with his head scouts and his men, and they attempted to come up with a plan. At this meeting was the brother of the Western Apache the Chiricahuas renegades had killed earlier in the day. This brother basically called Davis a coward and said essentially, "You're always willing to point a gun at us up at the res, but now here you aren't willing to even let us die?" The brother of the slain Western Apache, his name was Ishnagosel, he eventually mutinied and led 11 scouts up to the battle to look for his dead brother. It's a tough read, but here's what Sweeney wrote about what happened next. Quote, "They found the corpse, and Ishnagosel went over to his brother. Hook described the poignant scene. The scout embraced his brother's body and, quote, talked to him, just as if he were alive. 'All right, you are killed now. You are traveling by yourself now. This is what we joined up as scouts for, and I am still here. I intended to go with you also, but I missed out.'" End quote. The scout untied a blanket from his waist and covered his brother. End all quotes. The following day, the entire group of soldiers went up to the battleground, uncovered the dead brother, and realized to their horror that Chihuahua and his men had brutally mutilated the body. They'd cut off his nose and stuck a large knife through the cavity. The crying Apache men, an action I had never read about in terms of Apache men before this, but the crying Apache men could not dislodge the knife. So Captain Wirt Davis stepped down from his horse, leaned over the dead Apache scout's face, and pulled the knife from his skull. He then told his scouts, quote, "What the Chiricahuas have done here is wrong. The other Chiricahuas are all up at San Carlos and Fort Apache, but these Chiricahuas down here, still on the warpath, will never go back to San Carlos or Fort Apache, because they have done wrong on this body." End quote. He did not know it at the time, but he was not lying. During all this business with the various Davises and Chihuahua and Naiche, Captain Crawford and Tom Horn had followed Geronimo's trail north. By September 1885, the 63-year-old Geronimo had decided to head back to Arizona and try and retrieve his family, who had again been taken prisoner and sent to the reservation, or so Chihuahua thought. Geronimo's biographer, Angie Debo, aptly describes why he was forced to get his family when she wrote, quote, "Apaches were devoted to their families, also in their well-structured division of labor. A man without a wife to prepare food and clothing was as seriously handicapped economically as was a woman without a male provider." End quote. The men needed someone to brew their tiswin, cook their meals, and mend their moccasins. But also, the Apache men loved their family. Crawford's, Horn's, Chato's, and Davis's journey across the Mexican mountains from west to east, and then north through the Chihuahua Desert, much of it through blinding rain and violent thunderstorms, it was fraught with peril and tension. At one point, Tarahumara Indians set up an ambush for a Lieutenant Elliott and his Apache scouts, but ominous clouds prevented them from springing this canyon trap. These Tarahumaras would eventually encircle Elliot and fire nearly 100 rounds at him as he waved a white flag. But because the Mexicans were horrible shots, Elliot was unscathed. Elliot and his Apache Scouts would eventually be rounded up and arrested by these Mexican forces. Lieutenant Davis, who spoke Spanish very well, he would bail them out of jail after challenging the Mexican forces with, quote, "We will fight right now," end quote. After more pursuing and traipsing through the desert with tired horses, weary men, and exhausted rations, the Americans under Crawford, which included Tom Horn, ran into some Mexican officials for a second time, and they were told in no uncertain terms to leave Mexico. This did not bother the American commanders, though, and Lieutenant Davis would later write that he was not sad for, quote, "We were practically at the end of our rope," end quote. Speaking of rope, while en route back to the reservation and into the States, Captain Crawford and his men ran into a Major Frederick Van Vliet, and he was on a scouting mission against the Apaches. With Van Vliet was an army surgeon named William T. Corbusier, and this surgeon would recall this chance meeting well on account of one scout named Tom Horn, who was performing rope tricks for everyone's amusement. Over in New Mexico, Geronimo, with about 10 followers, half women, half men, they had crossed back into the United States and they were taking a circuitous route back to Fort Apache. And they had one goal in mind: rescue the captured family members. They sleuthed around the mountains of southern New Mexico for quite some time before finally being seen on September 10th. The race was on. After being spotted, Geronimo had a new goal: throw the Americans and their scouts off his trail and create a diversion. A violent diversion. Beginning on September 10th, Geronimo and his small band would raid every ranch, cabin, and homestead they came across. They'd steal horses and whatever else they desired from the buildings they would loot. They set fire to cabins and homes. They killed 5 people. Pretty much they killed whomever they came across or tried to kill him, including a 17-year-old boy. They'd usually send shots through the men and then smash their heads in with a rock. They kidnapped the 17-year-old boy's 11-year-old brother. And they went from the Black Range in New Mexico to the Mimbres Valley and then over to the Mogollon Mountains. And once in those mountains, they camped on the Gila River, not too far from the hot springs my wife and I enjoyed this time last year. Surprisingly, Geronimo did come across a woman and her 2 children, which they spared. By now, state militias, the father of the dead and kidnapped boy, and the army were all in pursuit. But many would eventually give up only hours behind the Apaches. The boy's father would remark that he didn't want to spook the Indians for fear that they'd kill his son. He was, at this time, assuming that his son was still alive. This boy's name was Santiago McKin, and spoiler alert, he would write about his ordeal later in life. This raid in New Mexico was meant to be a diversion, but it would have profound consequences for Geronimo's people, the Chiricahua Apaches. The federal government was in talks with Mexico to have joint operations against them by now. Crook had talked to Governor Torres in Sonora, and the governor agreed that American forces may enter Sonora in pursuit. And surprisingly, that Sonoran forces would even help General Crook. But we will see how that will go. And very importantly, Washington decided to hand control of the reservation solely over to Crook and the Army. No more dual control from the Indian Agency and the Army. Life was about to get a whole lot more difficult for the Chiricahua Apaches. both peaceful and renegade. But the final change this raid made was that Washington decided that if these hostile Apaches ever turned themselves in, they would be shipped straight to prison at Fort Marion near St. Augustine, Florida. And eventually, that would expand to every single Chiricahua. And it was all thanks to Geronimo's escape, his raids, and the lengthy international pursuit. Obviously, Geronimo knew none of this, and now that he had distracted the White Eyes, he was going to break his family out of the reservation. It would prove to be a daring raid, a cunning maneuver, and a huge embarrassment for Crook and the army. By September 19th, Geronimo had crossed into Arizona, and his first action was to shoot a man through the mouth, killing him. For the next few days, the old medicine man slowly made his way through the rugged mountains and terrain until he reached the outskirts of Fort Apache. He'd arrive shortly after midnight on September 22nd. While there, he ran into a White Mountain Apache woman who told him that the only family members who were there on the reservation were his wife and child. Not the ones who had been captured recently. No, his wife and child had been sent to the Mescalero Apaches over by Ruidoso and Fort Stanton. The Mescaleros at this time wanted nothing to do with the outbreak. They had been punished thoroughly for their role in the Victoria War. This war happened between my last episode over the Apaches and this one. And I did not cover it, and I will not be covering it. So when Geronimo's family arrived at the Mescaleros' land, they promptly turned them into the authorities, who then brought them back to Fort Apache. Undaunted by this news, and happy to at least have one of his wives back, he snuck into her wickiup and took her and his son in the dead of night. They slipped back as quickly as they could east towards New Mexico. Just like that, Geronimo had led an enormous military force through the deserts and mountains of the American Southwest and Mexican Northwest. They'd killed and tortured and mutilated Americans and Mexicans and even their fellow Apaches. Geronimo had then snuck back into the States, killed and mutilated again, gone all the way back to Fort Apache near where it all started, and he successfully broke his wife and child out of the reservation. All in only 4 months. And Geronimo was in his 60s. General Crook's response? Quote, "Kill Geronimo and his entire party." End quote. On his way towards New Mexico, and ultimately Old Mexico, Geronimo and his party killed a wagon driver and looted the wagon, which included a whole bunch of candy. Candy, which Santiago McKinn will later say, the Apache ate in one sitting. Young Santiago would later say this candy binge made all the Apache quite ill. He also said that he believes they spared his life in a game of chance, which of course is the Apache's favorite pastime besides Tiswin. Thankfully for him, one of the Apaches had bet on his life and won. On October 6th, Geronimo was back in Mexico, but not before killing yet again. This time it was an army private. During Geronimo's daring raid, both Chihuahua and Naiche had also traveled back into the States, and they were doing their own depredations around the Chiricahuas Mountains. They killed 2 ranchers, they killed a miner, they shot another guy through the stomach, they stole a ton of horses, hundreds. They raided homes, and then they too returned to Mexico. I don't want to get into the stories, but the Apaches would leave Mexico briefly to find their families again, and they would kill a Navajo scout, wound and kill soldiers, kill cowboys and miners, and anyone they came across, including a woman. They killed a woman's husband and then stripped the woman naked before bashing in her skull with a rifle. She survived. They stole, they mutilated, etc. It gets tiring. The residents of the American Southwest and the politicians in D.C. were also very tired of it. Having little left to do but plan, General Crook released the scouts that were on this previous mission, at least until he could formulate another incursion into Mexico. For this second attack, he was again sending Wirt Davis and Captain Crawford. Crook wanted 8 companies of 25 Apache Scouts each, which would be a total of 200 Apache Scouts. 100 would be going with Wirt Davis, and 100 would be going with Captain Crawford. Both Chato and Mickey Free declined to sign up for this mission. Both of them had bounties on their heads when it came to Geronimo, Chihuahua, and Naiche. Crawford's second in command would be 35-year-old Lieutenant Marion Moss. For this mission, Tom Horn was officially Chief of Scouts. Why not Al Sieber? Horn said it was because he was too, quote, crippled up and too old for such hard work, end quote. But another Chief of Scouts claimed it was because Al didn't get along with Crawford. Yet another interpretation, by the way, I don't discount that one, but another interpretation was that Crook needed Sieber at the res in case trouble happened. Which, if you subscribe and listen to the Apache Kid series, you know is exactly what happens. Just not quite yet. Speaking of the Apache Kid, he was on this mission as well. Tom Horn spoke Spanish and some Apache, so he was a great asset to the team. Regardless, Horn was in charge of 25 Apache Scouts as they headed east and then south. They'd leave for Fort Bowie on November 11th, 1885. While this next invasion was going on, one Chiricahua Apache hostile leader, a man named Ulzana, he had snuck back into the States to kill Chato and Mickey Free. And Ulzana almost got to Chato. But he was unsuccessful in his vendetta when Chato got one of his muscle spasms, which forced him to flee on a horse with his wife to the safety of Fort Apache. During Ulzana's 1,000-mile stretch of raids, there were beheadings, children's heads were bashed in and thrown into a fire. The White Mountain Apaches on the res got angry because it was White Mountain Apache children. More people were killed. There was almost a war between the White Mountain and the Chiricahua Apaches. It was a huge thorn in Crook's side. But beyond that, it was just more relentless violence and the slaughter of so many of what I would call innocent people. Anywhere from 38 to 45 whites, Mexicans, and Apache women and children were killed by Ulzana before he escaped back into Mexico yet again. Crawford and Horn were called on to find Ulzana, which they attempted to do in western New Mexico and eastern Arizona, but they were unsuccessful. On December 11th, Crawford and Horn, as well as Wirt Davis and his men, they all crossed back over into Mexico. And immediately, things went south. The Sonorensans and the people of Chihuahua, they thought they were being invaded by Apaches. The Apaches were occasionally allowed to wander off from the main group and go hunt, but they were supposed to be accompanied by a white man. Unfortunately, there just weren't enough of them on this particular expedition, so Mexicans and Mexican police often thought the Apaches were the enemy. At one point, there was a kerfuffle in a town that saw the Apache Kid get arrested by the Russian Kostrelitsky, I talked about this in the Apache series. In the end, it was Tom Horn who had to smooth things over. It was also up to Tom Horn to find the trail of Ulzana, which he kinda did. He actually found the trail of Chihuahua when he and his scouts were sent south to the Carcay Mountains on Christmas Day by Crawford. Despite his pride in being chief of scouts, Tom Horn would write in his autobiography, quote, "How I did miss Sieber, for he knew everything," end quote. Tom would later say that his scouts did the best they could and they stuck doggedly on the trail. Just for fun, I'll read the names of some of his scouts by quoting from Sweeney. Quote, Naiche, whose knowledge of the Sierra Madre rivaled Geronimo's. Tzedkizin, Fatty, Cooney, and Juan Segotze. End quote. They be gone for 2 weeks as they searched for the renegades. Meanwhile, Crawford set up a base camp on Christmas Day near the small town of Nacoro Chico. Horn actually describes Crawford in his book. He wrote of the man, quote, "I did not know Crawford, but he had a great reputation as a go-to-'em kind of fella, and no man would look at him and call him afraid or negligent. He looked good to me. He had a regular wolf snap to his jaw. Really, the only thing that I was afraid of was that the country would be too rough for him. When I was leaving him 15 days before, he said, quote, 'Now, Chief, you show me the way and I will be there in a Hank Monk time,' and all quotes." So who is Hank Monk? It's a good question. Apparently, he was a real man and a real fast stagecoach driver that Mark Twain wrote about. He was famous for driving a stagecoach in the 1870s from Carson City, Nevada, to Placerville, California in record time. So Crawford was a reader, apparently. He was also a man of much contemplation and a man who seemed to have had his own sort of medicine. And I say that because a few weeks prior to his encampment in Mexico, he had met an old friend at Fort Grant. While reminiscing with his old friend, he told the man who wrote it down that, quote, "When I go down into Mexico, I will not return," end quote. It seems the Apaches weren't the only ones who had premonitions of the future. On New Year's Eve, some trouble was almost stirred when a deputy U.S. Marshal arrived at Crawford's camp and presented an arrest warrant for one of the scouts who had committed a murder back in 1882. Obviously, this alarmed the Apaches, who began to worry they all might get into trouble because of their past. Crawford, though, he de-escalated the situation and convinced the deputy to let this Apache continue to scout, and he can be arrested after the mission. The deputy agreed. To further allay the situation, Crawford then announced that there would be a $100 reward for the man who discovered Geronimo's camp, and also that they were leaving on the 3rd of January 1886, and they were going to link up with Tom Horn and his scouts, who were apparently hot on the trail of the renegades. The night before they left, the Apaches held a ceremony while the officers watched, and the Apaches danced and kissed a sacred object, and then a medicine man predicted they would soon meet Geronimo. And his medicine had been strong. I believe in medicine. I believe that there is a connection to the quote-unquote supernatural that modern Western man especially seems to have forgotten about. My medicine is Christianity, but I believe that there is power on the earth and humans can access it. I get mine through the Holy Ghost. Others get theirs through dances or sings or any number of rituals. The older I get, the more open I am to the ways of the ancients, and it would be wise to listen to them. I won't follow all the ancients, for I have my own medicine already, but just because I believe mine is the true medicine does not mean that the others are powerless. I actually believe many medicines have immense power, just not always for good. This ceremony came at a pretty fortuitous time for the Apache Scouts, because up until now, Crawford had become frustrated with them and had began assuming, and so did his subordinates, but the army in Mexico had began to think the Apache Scouts' hearts weren't in it, and that maybe they were keeping important information from the army. But this dance and sing, it seemed to have calmed their fears, and it was just in time. Way down south in the rugged and harsh mountains filled with Anasazi ruins built by the descendants of the Chacoans in the Sierra Madre Mountains, Horn led 2 other scouts, or maybe the other way around. But Horn and his scouts were hot on the trail of some renegade Apaches, and eventually they approached a rough stretch of mountains known in Spanish as Espinosa del Diablo, or the Devil's Backbone. Horn described the area as quote-unquote fearfully broken. A few days before, Horn had actually sent 2 scouts up to Crawford to inform him that he would soon make contact with the enemy. On the 7th, Crawford received the word, and he immediately packed up he and his scouts to follow Tom Horn. He left most of his American soldiers behind, and he took primarily Apache Scouts. He then informed the small group that no fires were to be made. Despite it being January in the mountains of the desert, it gets real cold. And he told them they were to wear moccasins instead of boots, since they would be much quieter. A fine idea, except what Tom Horn said, that the land was fearfully broken. These moccasins wore out faster than they anticipated. This was a terrain of deep canyons, high cliffs, sharp rocks. One of Crawford's men would write of the area that, quote, the country was so rough that it seemed that nature must have made a special effort in that direction. End quote. Along the way, the American men were amazed at the Apache Scouts, who were now on their best behavior. The previously mentioned Moz said about them, quote, nothing escaped their watchful eyes as they marched silently in their moccasins' feet. Their system of advance guards and flankers was perfect. End quote. Another one of Crawford's men, a man named Ship, he said of the Apache, quote, watching the scouts, one could not help thinking how hopeless was the attempt to catch the hostile Chiricahuas with men trained and equipped in the manner of our own soldiers. End quote. He went on to say, quote, the Chiricahuas were a never-ending source of wonder. Their knowledge of country, their powers of observation and deduction, their watchfulness, endurance, and ability to take care of themselves under all circumstances made them seem at times like superior beings from another world. If our little army of 25,000 was composed of such men and animated by the proper spirit, it would be unconquerable by the best army now existing in Europe. End quote. On January 9th, 1886, Tom Horn and his men finally saw the camp of the renegade Apaches. He immediately sent one of his scouts to run back and tell Crawford, who was again already on his way. Once word made it to the captain, who had already been marching for 6 hours, he decided to march another 12 miles in 12 hours to meet up with Tom Horn. And it was 12 miles of dangerous and steep and treacherous territory. With his 75 scouts, Crawford decided on an overnight journey, hoping the darkness would conceal them. And it was a dark and a quiet night. There was no moon. Crawford, though, was undaunted. He was going to put an end to the Apaches' depredation and bring the American Southwest into the 19th century, or he would die trying. In the early dawn hours of January 10th, 1886, before the sun had risen, Crawford and his scouts finally met up with Tom Horn and his Apaches. Horn, Moz, Ship, and Crawford had a small and quiet meeting where they decided they were going to surround the camp. But as they were attempting to, rocks were displaced. Mules and horses were spooked, and the renegade Apache within the camp became alerted. The firing began near the horses and mules when the renegades approached the beasts to see what the fuss was about. Moz, who was not yet in position, later said, "The renegades opened fire first," but Ship and Horn disagreed. They claimed the antsy and angry White Mountain Apaches opened fire on the Chiricahuas in retaliation for past grievances. Mainly the slaughter of their family by Ulzana, who I mentioned earlier. Regardless, the shooting started, and with an opening to the south, on account of Moz not yet being in place, his position was the furthest, most of the Apaches escaped. The animals had been 400 yards from the camp, so the renegades had had a good head start. Horn mentions that he clearly heard Geronimo's voice yelling for the women and children to flee and for his warriors to fight. But Horn, in his book, he has a whole paragraph where he commands the men to surround the camp and their scouts, which that was Crawford. Crawford ordered that. When Horn published his biography later, autobiography, a lot of military men were both angry and amused, a little tickled, because in many spots throughout the book, Horn places himself in the commanding officer role, telling others what to do, when in reality, he was always the one being told what to do, unless he was out with just his scouts. So Geronimo's people fled, and many of the warriors fired at Crawford's men as they did so. Crawford's and Horn's and the army and scouts, they all fired back, all their men, but it seems like no one was wounded on either side. Therefore, all 80 hostiles escaped into the mountains. Some of the scouts gave pursuit, but still no enemies or scouts were injured. Ship and Moz, and even some of the Chiricahua scouts, they later believed that the battle and pursuit were fruitless because the Chiricahua didn't want to kill their brethren. Except for Geronimo. They wanted to kill him. Not to mention the White Mountain Apache scouts that were there were too afraid of Geronimo's band to give a hearty pursuit. So while the scouts were adept at finding the enemy, they were less adept when it came to killing the enemy. Crawford then occupied the camp that not so long ago held the sleeping Apaches. Crawford then realized he was in possession of all of the renegade Apaches' possessions, all their food, blankets, all their animals, extra weapons, everything. Geronimo's people realized this too. And not long after they fled, Naiche sent word to Crawford that he wanted to parley. There was no way the renegade Apaches could survive the winter with nothing, and with both American and Mexican and Apache forces hot on their trail. Geronimo had believed this hideout, one used for centuries, the one that was just taken, he believed it was the Apache's safest stronghold in the region, possibly all of the Southwest, except for one very remote one in the Mogollon Mountains. So where else could they go if they were just found? What else could they have done besides continue running and raiding and running and killing and raiding and more running, more killing? I mean, they've been doing it for centuries. But the endless wave of Anglos would eventually drown them out, even up in their mountain strongholds. God, the mountain spirit, would not be able to save them this time. Naiche then sent a woman to talk to Crawford, Horn, and Moz, and the Apache woman relayed the message that they were ready to surrender and return to the reservation. Naiche and Geronimo sure had high hopes for that. Crawford agreed to talk, and they assigned a high plateau to meet on the following day. Relieved that the mission was about to finally be accomplished, excited about the prospect of bringing in Geronimo at long last, but also dead tired from the long, arduous, and dangerous 24-hour hike, Crawford set up his sleeping bag about 100 yards from the renegades' camp. And then he went to sleep. Meanwhile, the various scouts and sentinels on guard duty, who had just burned everything that wasn't important, they also began to pass out despite being on duty. But it didn't seem like they were just going to sleep. They seemed to be lulled to sleep. This puzzled and worried one Chiricahua scout who began to believe that Geronimo had used sleeping medicine on the entire outfit. So this medicine man countered it with a long sing and some of his own medicine. This seemed to have worked, as one by one the scouts began to awaken again. Now this night was cold, very cold and rainy. When it wasn't raining, it was misty or foggy. When Geronimo, who had indeed been spying on the camp, noticed that the scouts were countering his medicine with their own, Geronimo began to actually yell at the scouts' medicine man in anger. Many of the scouts took this as an ominous sign. At 7 a.m. the following rainy, cold, misty morning, to quote Malls, loud cries of alarm came from some of the scouts who were lying down below among the rocks. Lieutenant Ship, Mr. Horn, and I ran forward at once to ascertain the cause of the alarm, when a severe fire of musketry was opened on our camp. End quote. Musketry? Were these Wirt Davis's scouts, who believed, after following the trail, that these sleeping Apaches were Geronimo's and Naiche's renegades? It was actually, in fact, around 128 irregular Mexican soldiers who were made up mostly of the Apache's enemy in Mexico, besides the Mexicans, the Tarahumaras, and also ex-convicts of the public security. They had been marching for 17 days on the trail of the renegades, and it seems they mistook the Americans and their scouts for those fearful hostiles. In the initial volley, 3 scouts were injured. 2 of them had been sleeping. Some of the scouts screamed in Apache, still believing them to be their Apache allies. But only Mexican Spanish was the response. The irregulars were shouting, "Viva Mexico!" or "Viva Guerrero!" or as Tom Horn later recalled, quote, "Follow me, valientes!" End quote. Some of the Mexican soldiers were even commenting on how, quote, "the hair of the scouts was good and long," end quote. These Mexicans wanted to take some scalps. Chihuahua and Sonora still had a bounty. Crawford and other sleeping commanders reacted quickly, and Crawford sent Moz, Ship, and Tom Horn to, quoting Horn, "go ahead and see about it," end quote. Crawford was right behind them with a white handkerchief, and that was all. Horn wrote that as they approached the fighters, quote, "straight at us, they came on a run," end quote. Many of the Americans and even some scouts confirmed Tom Horn's bravery in this moment as he ran towards the Mexicans in the open shouting, "Soldados Americanos!" American soldiers. He then climbed on a rock and began waving his arms and shouting in Spanish for the Mexican soldiers to stop firing. He was unarmed, by the way. Crawford then yelled to Tom Horn, quote, "My God, Chief, can't you stop them? These scouts will kill them all," end quote. He didn't want an international incident. He didn't want the American Chiricahua scouts to kill all these Mexican soldiers. The whole time, all this running and yelling and shooting, Crawford was also standing out in the open waving the white handkerchief. And this went on for apparently 15 or 20 minutes with all of the whites unarmed. Finally, Tom Horn seems to have gotten to the soldiers, and some of them were approaching the Americans. Larry Ball and Tom Horn in Life and Legend describes what happens next, and I'll read it for y'all. Quote, "By this time, dawn was breaking, and Lieutenant Moz, who could see Chief of Scouts Horn talking with the Mexicans, quote, felt sure that the trouble was over," end quote. Crawford and Moz then approached them. Quote, "I told them distinctly in Spanish who we were," end quote, declared Moz, and pointed out that he and other officers were in uniform. "When 4 Mexicans approached Horn, quote, the first 3 passed me without stopping," end quote, he wrote, while, quote, "the 4th stopped and drew a bead on me. I called to him in Spanish, 'Lower your rifle. We are American soldiers.' He lowered his rifle about a second and smiled." End all quotes. During this whole shootout, the Apaches had only responded with a few rounds. They had been told not to shoot. The Americans had not shot at all, and in fact, like I've said, they were totally unarmed, except for Crawford, who was holding a white handkerchief. One of the Mexican commanders, Major Mauricio Corredor, the slayer of Victorio, actually, he believed the Americans had been low on men and ammo, which is why they did not fire back. And this was a mistaken belief he would regret, but not for long. Corredor, it turns out, had no intentions of peace. He was thinking only of one thing: "I want my scalps." Corredor and 10 of his armed men approached the Americans, while 15 or so, also armed men, began to surround the Americans on the rocky hill above. They were encircling Crawford and his men, his unarmed men. During this encirclement, the Apache Scouts slowly began to emerge from cover. The Tarahumara and Chihuahuan forces started to notice them in return, and eventually, they all started to hurl insults at each other. They were, after all, bitter enemies, with centuries of fighting between the 3 groups. Corredor and his men had killed Victorio and even Ho. One Apache scout yelled at the Mexican forces, quote, "Don't run away if you are men, for you are going to meet up with men today," end quote. The Mexicans responded with, quote, "We are the troops that cleaned up Victorio's bunch. We killed Victorio, and we can kill every one of you," end quote. This whole time, one Apache scout, thinking on his feet, had been leading an ammunition mule to the hidden scouts, who were replenishing their ammo belts and rifles. A battle was certainly about to begin. And it did, when Fatty, one of Horn's scouts, yelled, "All right, get ready. We are going to fire on you right now." End quote. I will let Sweeney deftly tell the tale of what happens next. The American and Mexican officers were unaware of the critical moment until they heard the, quote, "sharp snap of the breech loaders," end quote, as the scouts inserted their cartridges. However, Major Corredor, who had seen the heads and rifles of 50 to 60 scouts concealed in rocks 30 yards in front of him, became noticeably nervous. He began to back away from open ground toward Horn. While the parley was going on, which lasted less than 10 minutes, other Mexicans moved around their left toward the highest hill on Crawford's right flank. Crawford, sensing the explosive situation, said to Moz, quote, "For God's sake, don't let them fire," end quote. Corredor and another officer, realizing that they had based their treachery on faulty assumptions, said, quote, no tiros, don't shoot, imploring Crawford to restrain his scouts. Now, Moz pivoted and walked briskly towards the scouts, ordering them not to shoot. Crawford, quote, climbed on a 5-foot-high rock, conspicuous above every other object, end quote, waving his flag of truce. about 25 yards from the captain, one member of Corredor's peace party had taken cover near, quote-unquote, a little tree. Evidently, the one designed to open the double cross. He fired the first shot, sending a bullet into Crawford's forehead, mortally wounding the stoic captain. End all quotes. Crawford wasn't the only one hit, though. Horn, who had also been standing on a smaller rock, he had been shot through the arm by the Mexican commander Corredor, who at first lowered his rifle and then smiled, just like the other Mexican had done with Maz. Horn wrote, quote, "Suddenly, he changed his mind. Then he took a quick aim at me and fired, hitting me in the left arm." End quote. It seems, except for that one sharpshooter, the Mexicans really are not good shots. I believe I mentioned that in one of the earlier Apache episodes, actually. In Horn's autobiography, he recounts how he, despite the painful flesh wound, immediately took charge after Crawford's murder and ordered Maz to one flank and shipped to the other. But of course, this is not what really happened. And it was indeed Maz who immediately took charge and sent Horn on one flank and Ship on the other, while he tried to gain control of the situation. A situation which was quickly spiraling out of control as the Mexicans began taking shots at every unarmed American they saw. But the tables turned very quickly, and within minutes, Corredor had been shot through the heart. Another Apache scout killed the man who had shot Crawford. Corredor's second-to-command took 13 bullets. Rather quickly, 9 out of 10 of the Mexicans who had duplicitously approached the Americans were dead. The Apaches, filled with medicine and bravery and anger, relentlessly attacked the Mexican and Tarahumara forces, and they drove them back some 300 to 500 yards away, all while not taking a single scratch. Later, one of Horn's Apaches, Tzedikizin, the leader of these brave scouts who were under Horn, he would laugh about how these Mexicans, quote, fell over each other to try to get out of the way, end quote. Eventually, Tzedikizin asked Horn if he and his scouts could pursue the fleeing Indians, but Horn refused to give the command. One of Horn's scouts would later say that if Horn had allowed them to pursue, they would have killed every one of the Mexicans. This second battle, where the Mexicans were retreating, lasted about an hour, and all the while both sides were hurling taunts at one another. Horn would yell at the Mexicans at one point and ask, quote, how they liked the entertainment, end quote. Horn said they responded with, quote, if we had not had enough to come out and fight again, end quote. Larry Ball describes a bit more of this conversation between the injured Horn and the Mexicans. Quote, when a Chihuahuan asked their identity, quote, I told him we were a bunch of sportsmen down from the United States looking for some game, and thanked him for the time we were having, end quote. Horn invited this man, quote, to get his valientes, or brave ones, together again and try another charge, end quote. When the Mexicans asked, quote unquote, what do you want? Horn replied, everything you have. Harvey Nashkin was close enough to hear these shouted challenges. When a Chihuahuan asked, quote, our officer to give him 12 of us scouts to kill, end quote, recalled Nashkin, Horn replied, quote, you think these scouts are like boys, but they can fight, end quote. Quote, the fight was going on again quite briskly, Horn recalled. Anyone who left the cover of the rocks was in danger of losing his life. It was not worth my while to try to stop it, end quote, Horn frankly admitted. The Americans, Horn among them, were still mystified at the persistence of the Mexican attacks. Quote, I thought Mexico and the United States were at war, and that we were in it, end quote, he recalled. End all quotes. Maz eventually asked Horn to restrain his men and see if he could get a parley with this new enemy. Here's a mix of Larry Ball and Tom Horn's autobiography of what happened next. And I would quote Horn's book more often, but he is quite the exaggerator, and it helps to have someone correct his versions. Quote, The Chihuahuans only grudgingly replied to the appeals of the chief of scouts. After we had driven them all away from us, they finally answered, Horn recalled. A Chihuahuan shouted, "Oh, you white man that talks Mexican, I want to talk to you." "What do you want?" replied Horn. "I spoke to you many times and you would not answer." "Now we want to talk," came the reply. I told them to stop firing a minute and I'd come over and tell them what we wanted, Horn later explained to correspondent Charles Loomis. The Mexican answered, "All right, put down your arms and come over." I took off my cartridge belt, laid down the gun I had picked up after being wounded, said Horn, and went over. In a very arrogant tone, one of the Chihuahuans asked, "What have you been doing here?" To which the chief of scouts replied, "I came over to tell you that we are American troops." When they asked for his commander, Horn informed them that he was severely wounded and would probably die. Then one of the Mexicans, an old man, said, "Our captain is killed too. Here is his gun," shaking a Winchester in his hand, "and I'd like to kill a gringo with the same gun." End all quotes. Maz was rather impressed with Horn and his bravado as he walked unarmed and injured over to the Mexicans. At one point, Maz almost called Horn back, but he did need a dialogue, and Horn's Spanish was rather impressive. Eventually, Horn motioned for Maz to join him, though, and Maz obliged. Here's Larry Ball, Horn shipping Maz's own words on the dialogue that occurred next. Quote, "When Horn finally beckoned to his commander to join him, Maz followed him over to where some of the Mexicans were lying. While these aggressors protested that the entire incident was all a mistake, they were very sorry, what a great pity, que lastima, and so on, and that they thought the Americans were renegades, Maz did not believe them. Nor did Horn. I asked them if they did not know an American from a Bronco, Apache warrior, at 25 yards, he recalled. And they said they saw the Indian heads in the rocks, taking them for hostiles. All 6 of us white men were in full view of them when they shot Crawford, wrote William Shipp, and were wearing either uniforms or civilian dress that clearly distinguished them from Apaches. End all quotes. Despite not believing the Mexicans' explanation, Maz was ready to put this whole bloody and sad international incident behind them. But things were long from over. Once in the Mexicans' camp, Horn and Maz talked things over with the soldiers, who insisted they receive the entire captured herd of animals the Americans and their scouts had taken from Geronimo the day before. Obviously, the Americans protested. It was technically their scouts' loot from a successful operation. So the Mexicans then asked for 5 or 6 of the horses or mules to take their wounded men home. Maz said he would think about it. And then the Americans returned to their camp. The situation was still not de-escalated, though, and eventually the Mexicans worked themselves up into anger and demanded Horn come back, which he did. But this time, Maz sent the surgeon over who had recently arrived with Wirt Davis and his men. Despite the Mexicans' duplicitousness and unwarranted violence, Maz still had compassion for the wounded Mexican soldiers that he had seen when he was in the camp last. Before Horn walked over again, though, he told his scouts to, quote, "Be sure to kill all the Mexicans if they killed me." End quote. It was an order the Apaches would have gladly carried out. During this entire affair, Geronimo, Naiche, and Chihuahua were watching it all unfold. Paul Andrew Hutton writes, quote, "They watched in amazement for more than an hour as the Apache Scouts and the Mexican militia, who numbered about 150, blazed away at one another. It was clear that the Scouts had the upper hand. Geronimo was not a man given to mirth, but he laughed and laughed and laughed." End quote. After his bout of laughing at all of this death happening because of him, he sent a woman to the Americans' camp. She would tell Maz that we saw the whole thing, but we're still willing to talk, but not until you get rid of the Tarahumaras and the Mexicans. Essentially, she said, we hate them both. And that was the word from Geronimo. So now, this second meeting had a new goal. Get the Mexicans out of the way. During this second meeting between Horn and the Mexicans, the leader of the Mexicans still insisted falsely that they had no idea they were Americans, and they thought they were hostile Apaches. A claim that is absurd. And even with the doctor to assist the wounded and some extra rations that Maz gave to the Mexicans, they still refused to leave. And in fact, they further provoked the Americans by saying, why don't you let your Indians come down here and fight us in this little open plain? Quote, we'll give them some more of it, end quote. More of what, though? A few Apaches had been wounded when they were sleeping. Other than that, the Mexicans had injured an unarmed Horn and had mortally shot the unarmed American Captain Crawford with a bullet to the forehead. A bullet which left brains on his face after he'd fallen off his boulder. Somehow, he had not died right away, but actually he would live for quite a few more days. The following day, the 12th of January, after an uneasy and sad night's rest, Maz had had enough, and he decided to move camp north in the hopes Geronimo would follow and meet them elsewhere, away from the Mexicans. As the Americans passed by, Maz sent Horn, who was by now in a lot of pain. He sent Horn and another scout named Aguirre with the 6 horses that they had wanted. On a ridge above the Mexican camp, Horn yelled down for them to come get the horses. But the Mexicans refused. Horn, in pain and now angry, yelled at them that he wasn't their slave. Still no answer. So the Americans took their horses back. But unfortunately, as they were traveling, some of them wandered over, the horses, some of them wandered over to the Mexican camp. Maz then sent Aguirre to recover him. But instead, the Mexicans kidnapped Aguirre, and the leader said to his men, quote, he is going to die here with us, end quote, meaning Aguirre. Frustrated, Maz, the only American who could speak Spanish that didn't have a big gaping hole in his arm, he was forced to go get the horses and now his captured scout from the clutches of the Mexicans. But of course, the Mexicans took Maz prisoner as well. I'll spare you the obnoxious back and forth with the indignant Mexicans and the frustrated Americans, but eventually, by a stroke of luck, Maz presented the Mexicans with a note from a Sonoran official stating that the Americans were allowed to be in Mexico. So finally, they were released. But not before the Apache Scouts began gearing up for war and shouting insults at the Mexicans. Actually, this also helped the Americans to be freed. Unfortunately, in Tom Horn's autobiography and later interviews, he greatly overplays his role in all of this. I mean, he already had a significant role. At one point, he makes up a ruse and eventually states later that Geronimo himself had helped Tom Horn get Maz free. It is ridiculous, and it's why I don't quote from Horn's book too often. Finally, through heavy rain and fog, the Americans and the many, many Apache Scouts were on their way north, away from the Tarahumaras and the Chihuahuas. They then got word that Geronimo was ready to talk the following day. On the 15th, true to their word, for once, Geronimo, Naiche, Chihuahua, and Nana met with Maz and Horn. When Geronimo opened the meeting with, "Why are you here and chasing me?" Maz responded bluntly with, quote, "I came to capture or destroy you and your band." End quote. Surprised but pleased with the bluntness, Geronimo told Maz that he would meet General Crook on the Mexican-American line in 1 month at the San Bernardino Peak. As a show of good faith, Geronimo then turned over Nana, another warrior, and 7 women and children. Again in his book, Horn takes all the credit for the meeting and for the hopeful surrender, which, the way he explains it, is not really how it went down. And his over-talkedness did have international consequences. In one town, as they headed back to the States, Horn told a local man who ended up being a spy that essentially the engagement was an accident, the engagement with Corredor and Crawford. And I don't even know why he said that, because he doesn't even think it was an accident. I mean, he didn't at the time. He writes that it wasn't in his autobiography. Yet for some reason he got carried away, and maybe just to appease the Mexicans he was talking to, he said it was an accident. Those words were sent to President Diaz in Mexico City, and they were later used against the U.S., who had by then accused Mexico of some chicanery. So sometimes Tom Horn talks a little bit too much. As the Americans traveled north, miraculously, I mean, it truly is a miracle, Captain Crawford, despite the missing brain and the hole in his head, awoke while in transit. He opened his eyes and then put an arm around Maz. Maz, surprised and elated, told the captain that he would arrange his affairs. And don't worry, Geronimo's going to surrender. Crawford could only nod his head before he passed out again. He would finally die the following day. His medicine had been strong and his prediction had been correct. He would indeed die in Mexico after saving the lives of others. He was buried near Nacori Chico, but his remains would later be transferred to Nebraska. Crook, devastated at Crawford's assassination, would issue General Field Orders No. 2, and it read, quote, "With feelings of the deepest sorrow, the Brigadier General commanding announces the death of Captain Emmett Crawford, 3rd Cavalry. His loss is irrepressing. Brave as a lion, tender and gentle as a woman, always averse to alluding to his own achievements, temperate, noble, and wise, who was during his life an honor to his profession and in death is an example to his comrades." End quote. Shipp would later say of Crawford, quote, "It would be well if all of us could keep in our minds the memory of this devoted and chivalrous soldier, whose whole life was one long sacrifice, and whose death was a direct result of his efforts to save others. Let us try to remember this one as our ideal of what a true man should be." End quote. Maz and his men finally reached America on February 1st, 1886. But not without difficulty. First of all, the Mexicans taunted them the entire way and even threatened war at one point. And then Mexican merchants smuggled in mezcal to the scouts, who all got drunk and started fighting. They fought to the point where the White Mountain Apaches and the Chiricahua Apaches loaded their rifles and squared off. Nothing's ever easy with the Apaches. But they made it back by February with the hopes that Geronimo would turn himself in. Soon. Meanwhile, throughout December, old Zana continued his killing and raiding and stealing. He'd killed quite a few soldiers and even more civilians. About 15 people perished before old Zana slipped into Mexico before the new year. The people of the Southwest were even further enraged, and the army was embarrassed, and Washington was unhappy. The new president, Cleveland, was thinking of replacing General Crook. Unfortunately for the exhausted Maz, Crook sent he and all his men and scouts directly back down into Mexico in early February so that they could wait for the hostiles to turn themselves in. This time, though, they stayed in camp. Except for a few scouts who would visit 2 Americans who had set up a mezcal brewery, Americans who had no qualms selling to the Apache Scouts. Meanwhile, I will spare you the details, but Geronimo, Ulzana, and Chihuahua continue killing countless Mexicans and even some Americans as they looted, stole, and murdered their way through northern Mexico before they even surrendered. The Mexican authorities were powerless to stop them, and the Americans did not have the will or authority any longer to pursue them. All of this looting was done to replenish Geronimo and his band's lost stock before they went north and resettled at the reservation, which was a goal that was now impossible because, remember, once they turned themselves in, they were going to Florida. Unbeknownst to them, of course. Otherwise, they'd never turn themselves in at all. Then in March, this story is truly brutal and awful, and with my own wife being pregnant, it pains me severely. But in March, some American ranchers sprang a trap on the renegade Apaches who were trying to steal their horses. One of the Americans shot an Apache named Naiche between the eyes and killed him. The other Apaches ran off. The Americans then scalped Naiche and threw his body into a fire. The renegade Apaches were livid, and they took their anger out on the Mexicans, with the first casualties being a family. They killed the 3 men and then took the pregnant woman hostage with her 2 young children ages 1 and 3. They then killed the children and the mother, and they placed the once pregnant woman's baby in her dead arms. They left the grisly and horrific scene as evidence of their anger. And I now remember why I stopped the Apache Series in the first place. Finally, on March 19, 1886, Geronimo and 22 warriors reached Ma's camp. They then, of course, demanded that Crook needed to come down there and meet them right now, for they weren't negotiating with Ma's, only Crook. Eventually, Ma's convinced them to instead head north towards America, where they would be safe from Mexicans and where Crook would meet them. Geronimo refused, but did agree to go north. Once at the rendezvous location 12 miles north at Embudo Canyon, 75 renegade Apaches flooded into the new camp. Only Chihuahua and 7 warriors were absent. Then, weeks went by without a sign or a word from General Crook. Weeks of hungry, tired, weary, and angry hostiles who were being fed mezcal by those American brewers. The main brewer, who had already been asked to stop by Ma's, was named Tribolet. He said, "I don't have to stop. That's why I fled the United States to begin with, so I can do what I wanted to do." Things were growing tense. The booze was not helping. And then finally, on March 25th, General Crook rode into Embudo Canyon around noon. Before long, Crook chose the meeting place and eventually 24 hungover warriors, with every one of them carrying a rifle and 2 cartridge belts, as well as brand new clothing they'd recently liberated. They all sat down around Crook, who'd placed himself on a rock. He scanned the angry crowd and would later remark that they looked as, quote, "fierce as so many tigers." End quote. The meeting started with Geronimo going on an angry tirade and blaming every single person and every single thing under the sun except himself for why they left the reservation and slaughtered and killed and destroyed over the past year. He said at one point, quote, "I think I am a good man, but in the papers all over the world they say I am a bad man. But it is a bad thing to say about me. I never do wrong without a cause." End quote. Unbelievable. Sorry for my editorializing there. It's just hard to not say something after reading those stories, and it's not over yet. Apparently, the entire time, Crook just sat there and stared at the ground as if he was thinking of something else. In fact, it seems, other than at the very beginning, Crook never looked at Geronimo once. At one point, Geronimo yelled at him, quote, "Why don't you look at me and smile at me?" End quote. Crook already knew that what Geronimo was saying was probably a lie, but he let him talk anyways. Tom Horn would say in his book that Geronimo, quote, was such a great talker that he could make wrong seem right. End quote. Crook was not amused. Geronimo would go and say, quote, "There is one God looking down on us all. We are all children of the one God. God is listening to me. The sun, the darkness, the winds are all listening to what we now say." End quote. Finally, when Geronimo's speech wore out, Crook said to the old medicine man, quote, "Your mouth talks too many ways." End quote. Obviously, Geronimo did not enjoy this slight and said, quote, "I want no more of this." End quote. At first, his warriors began to stir, but Naiche calmed them down with the wave of his hand. Naiche was technically the one in charge, for Geronimo was only a medicine man. But then more commotion came when Chihuahua and Ozana and 6 warriors drove a whole herd of stolen horses right into the camp. This was not a good thing, since the White Mountain Apache Scouts had not forgotten that Ozana had killed 21 of their own people, including children. Ozana also drove his horse right into camp, knocking things over and disrupting men's dinners. But then Chihuahua saw Crook and immediately humbled himself. He got off his horse, strolled over to the old wolf, and shook his hand. Chihuahua would later say, quote, "His heart had quieted down." End quote. Eventually things calmed down again, and then Crook stated his terms. He said, quote, "You must make up your own mind whether you will stay out on the warpath or surrender unconditionally. If you stay out, I'll keep after you and kill the last one, even if it takes 50 years. End quote. Which reminds me of what Crook told the chief of the Pitt River Indians in Oregon. If you'll recall, he said, "I was in hopes that you would continue the war, and then, though I were to kill only one of your warriors while you killed 100 of my men, you would have to wait for those little people," pointing to the Indian children, "to grow to fill the place of your braves, while I can get any number of soldiers the next day to fill the place of my 100 men. In this way, it would not be very long before we would have you all killed off, and then the government would have no more trouble with you." End quote. After telling the Apaches that, he told them to think on it, and then get back to him with an answer. He'd later write in his journal, though, quote, "The result of the interview indicated nothing." End quote. The following day, the 26th, Crook met with Geronimo again and all the rest of them and convinced them that you will have to go east when you surrender, east to Florida, but I'll make sure it's only for 2 years. Later that day, Chihuahua sent word that he wanted to surrender, for he missed his family. Also, he wanted his camp removed from Geronimo's. Ominous foreboding. Crook wrote to Sheridan in Washington and said, quote, "Today things look more favorable." End quote. On March 27th, at high noon, Geronimo, Chihuahua, Naiche, Nana, and all the men came in to formally surrender. Chihuahua said to Crook with an extended hand, quote, "It seems to me that I have seen the one who makes the rain and sends the winds, or he must have sent you to this place. I surrender myself to you because I believe in you, and you do not deceive us. You must be our God. You must be the one who makes the green pastures, who sends the rain, who commands the winds. You must be the one who sends the fresh fruits that appear on the trees every year." End quote. Crook answered in Apache to Chihuahua and told him, "All is well. Inja." Naiche was next, and he said the same thing. He literally said, quote, "What Chihuahua says, I say." End quote. He said more, but Geronimo was last, and he uttered this famous quote, "Once I moved about like the wind. Now I surrender to you, and that is all. My heart is yours, and I hope that yours will be mine." End quote. David Roberts titled his book over the Apache, "Once They Moved Like the Wind." Geronimo then asked if Crook could send his wives and children to him, to which Crook said, "They will meet us along the trail." Of course, you're probably looking at how much time is left in this episode and wondering why it's not almost over. But that is because the end, while nigh, is not yet at hand. Nothing's ever easy with the Apache. That night, the 27th, the American brewmasters delivered gallons of whiskey to the hostiles who had just surrendered. Tom Horn had warned that this was a bad idea, but he was not taken seriously by Crook. Obviously, mayhem ensued. Gunshots went through the mule packers' tents. Naiche passed out drunk, and they were all hung over an ornery the following day. Actually, Geronimo and 4 of his men were still drunk the following morning at 6:45 a.m. That is when Bourke and Crook were leaving Embudo Canyon on the 28th. Bourke was disgusted as these Apaches were riding on mules, drunk as lords, as he said. Geronimo embraced Bourke and promised him that he would follow. But Bourke was beginning to have doubts. I talked a lot about the anthropological Bourke in the Apache series. Once Crook and Bourke left the canyon, Bourke turned to Crook and told him he should have the American brewmaster, Triboulet, killed, quote, "as a foe to human society. If you don't, it will be the biggest mistake of your life." End quote. How right he was. Crook absolutely should have stayed in the camp and probably led the hostile prisoners back himself. But he told his men that he had duties at Fort Bowie. Although what those duties were are unknown. But it probably had to do with explaining to Sheridan in Washington why he had deviated from D.C.'s explicit orders that these Apaches would never see Arizona again. Crook certainly had some explaining to do. Most of the men left behind, including Moz and Horn and others, disagreed with Crook leaving, but what could they do? He was their superior officer, and he was a very well-respected man, at least by those who were close to him. The rest of the camp did not pack up until afternoon, because most of the Apaches were drunk or hungover or both. Naiche, after he awoke from his stupor, would end up shooting his wife in the leg because he thought she was flirting with another man. So things were off to a rocky start. On the morning of the 29th, they continued to slowly leave the area and head for the United States. But before that could be successfully accomplished, Moz sent his lieutenant south to destroy the American brewmasters still. Triboulet would no longer be a hindrance to this operation. Obviously, when the Apaches found out, they were not thrilled about it either. Chihuahua took up the lead with his people, and they truly seemed to be ready and willing to surrender. But Geronimo and Naiche, they took up the back, and at only 2 miles to the border, they decided they just couldn't go any further on account of being just not well, just too dang hungover. They needed to rest. One of the packers, a man named Daly, immediately grew suspicious of this. He told Moz, quote, "The Chiricahuas had gone as far toward Fort Bowie as they intended on going," end quote. Still, Moz was not convinced. He believed Geronimo's word. Later that night, the Apaches somehow got drunk again. They fired, this time, shots over the Americans' heads, and 2 Apaches, one drunk, one sober, they came over to Moz and Daly's fire, and they began to quote-unquote gesticulate wildly while cursing at the wide eyes in Spanish and Apache. Daly told Moz that they were trying to get them to go to bed so that they could make their escape. Moz was still in doubt. Eventually, everyone but Daly and Moz went to bed. But while they were sitting by the fire, another shot whizzed over their head. Daly told Moz that in the coming morning, quote, there would not be a Chiricahua in camp, end quote. And then, the 2 just went to bed. Daly was mostly right. While Chihuahua and his group had stayed and were sleeping when morning came, Geronimo, Naiche, 18 warriors and 22 women and children were gone by around 2:30 a.m. Later, Naiche would say they left because they didn't like the way Crook spoke to them. Also, they were afraid of life in Florida. Well, yeah, who isn't? And lastly, that they were quote-unquote drunk. Sweeney sums up this whole disappointing episode well when he wrote, quote, "The combination of liquor, Crook's indifference, and fears for their lives under Chato's rule was enough to persuade them to renege on their promises to Crook, whom they left standing on the sidelines at Fort Bowie, looking like a foreman of a hopelessly deadlocked jury. Their flight would prolong the war by 5 months and cause Crook, already upset because President Cleveland had overruled the terms that he had negotiated, insisting on unconditional surrender, to request to be relieved from duty in Arizona. In the end, this change would have profound ramifications for the Chiricahua tribe. They had lost their one advocate, an influential man who would have continued to work on their behalf." End quote. I try to be sympathetic in my episodes, but this is so frustrating. They've caused so much death and destruction, and they could have ended it all right here. Instead, it's another 5 months of war and death and violence. Chihuahua was quoted as saying, "Geronimo will never come in now." When Crook returned to Fort Bowie, he received 2 devastating pieces of news. The first had been from Sheridan in Washington. It basically said, whatever deal you made is null and void. The entire tribe, both peaceful and hostile Chiricahuas, are being sent to Florida forever. The second piece of devastating news was from Moz, and it said that the entire deal you just made was null and void because Geronimo and Naiche had fled. On March 31st, Crook would send a message to Sheridan and the president in which he would say, quote, "I respectfully request that I may now be relieved from this command." End quote. Sheridan in Washington accepted his dismissal. Crook got word of his dismissal on April 2nd, the same day Crawford's body arrived in camp from Mexico. The same day Bourke told Crook that he'd been reassigned to Washington, and the same day that Chihuahua's group marched by single file towards Fort Apache. That's a heck of a sad day for Crook. But he wasn't done yet. On the 6th of April, there was a minor dramatic display when Chihuahua handed over the kidnapped boy Santiago McKinn. Unfortunately, as is often the case, the boy now only spoke Apache, and he pitched a fit, acted like a quote-unquote wild animal, and he refused to leave the Apache side. Eventually, though, he was given back to his grief-stricken father. Later that same day, Crook would meet with Chihuahua, and he told he and his people, quote, "I am going to leave you." End quote. He then told the Apaches to quit drinking Tiswin and start herding sheep. And then he told them, "You will all be leaving for Florida tomorrow." The following day, these 75 Chiricahua Apaches were disarmed, many of them for the first time. Then they boarded a train and they left for Florida. In the train was Chihuahua, Ulzana, Nana, and many other storied warriors that I did not have the time to go into detail about. Crook wrote in his journal that night, quote, "It is a big relief to get rid of them." End quote. By April 12th, Miles and his men, which included Horn, had given up hope of finding Geronimo, and they had returned to Fort Bowie just in time to see Crook embrace his men and leave for Prescott. His new replacement had just arrived, and this was General Nelson Miles, who was no friend of General Crook and had for years been scheming to get rid of the Gray Fox with Sheridan and Washington, D.C. Miles had no plans to use Chiricahua Apache Scouts, but he did not yet tell the Scouts this information. On April 20th, 1886, General Miles issued General Order No. 7, which basically said, "We White Eyes are the Army now. No more Scouts, especially Chiricahua." He increased troop levels, increased cavalry levels, began guarding passes and water holes, and he created a sort of special forces unit, which was to be led by Captain Lawton. Lawton was 6'5" and 225 pounds. And this is the same Captain Henry Lawton who got ambushed but survived earlier in the episode. Miles also set up signal towers and increased telegraph lines throughout the area. He set up observation posts at the tops of mountains. I mean, he was serious about ending this threat. Meanwhile, unsurprisingly, Geronimo and Naiche and the 40-odd hostile renegade Chiricahua Apaches, they went as west as they could in Mexico, raiding, killing, slaughtering, stealing. A lot more people died at their homes or ranches or on the road as they were going about their day. Heads were smashed to jelly. Another pregnant woman was murdered. Children were kidnapped. By late April, the 10th Cavalry of Buffalo Soldiers were in Mexico on his trail. They'd engage him, but they couldn't capture him. Mexican forces engaged him, but they couldn't capture him. Papago warriors pursued them, but they fled. Naiche and Geronimo would cross back and forth into Mexico and Arizona, killing everywhere they went, everyone they met, or trying to. 13 people in 2 weeks in Arizona. But the number was much, much higher than that. Later, Naiche would explain it by saying, quote, "We were afraid. It was war. Anybody who saw us would kill us. And we did the same thing." End quote. Really? A pregnant lady and the baby you took from her arms before smashing the baby into a wall? They would kill you? The countless unarmed cowboys and ranch hands, the children? By May, it seems they wanted to come in and surrender for real, though. The journey had been difficult. They wanted to talk to Crook again. Problem was, Crook was gone, and happy to be rid of him. But they didn't know that. So they crisscrossed Mexico and Arizona, killing and just killing, a lot of killing. They wanted again to get to Fort Apache. General Miles knew this, and so he asked if there were any Apache Scouts that would go to the old medicine man and talk to him. He kind of changed his mind about the Chiricahuas thing. But Miles did not get a single taker. He even offered a $2,000 bounty on Geronimo's head. Actually, the bounty was dead or alive, but still no takers, at least among the Chiricahua Apaches. Despite all of this, on May 25th, Naiche still snuck into the San Carlos Reservation and saw his family. He talked a while, found out that Crook was gone, and then he left. So both Naiche and Geronimo had snuck all the way back into where it all started, and they never got caught. Naiche and his men almost fell into a trap shortly after that while they were heading back down to Mexico, but they realized it was a trap at the last second and fled. On their way, I lost count a long time ago, but they killed 5 or 6 more Americans. At one point, Miles even hired old Tom Jeffords, the best white friend of Cochise. The only white friend of Cochise. But Miles hired him to talk to Naiche. But it was too late. He was already in Mexico. If you're interested in hearing about old Tom Jeffords, I did a subscriber-only episode on him. On June 7th, the special forces that Miles had created, and which was led by Lawton, they crossed into Mexico in hot pursuit of Geronimo. Tom Horn may have signed up for this and began in its initial phase, but he was ultimately recalled to Fort Apache, where he stayed for some time. He'll be back soon, though. This march through Mexico was going to be brutal to the extreme. By the end, Lawton and his men will have traveled over 3,000 miles. One of Lawton's officers would ride of northern Mexico and he'd say, quote, "One who does not know this country cannot realize what this kind of service means. Marching every day in the intense heat, the rocks and earth being so torrid that the feet are blistered, and rifle barrels and everything metallic being so hot that the hand cannot touch them without getting burnt. It is a country rough beyond description, covered everywhere with cactus and full of rattlesnakes and other undesirable companions of that sort. The rain, when it does come, comes as a tropical tempest, transforming the dry canyons into raging torrents in an instant." End quote. Eventually, Lawton would meet up with the Mexican force led by Patricio Valenzuela on June 18th. The prior day, after much pursuit, Valenzuela had surprised Geronimo and attacked the camp, which led to Geronimo's wife being shot and killed. But not before she emptied a pistol at the Mexican pursuers. After the short battle, Valenzuela cautioned his men on following Geronimo through the box canyon that he'd escaped in. But 3 men did not heed his advice, and all 3 were shot in the head by Geronimo, which is a testament to his sharpshooting skills. Of course, when Lawton surprised Valenzuela, the Mexicans almost opened fire on the Americans, but unlike with Crawford, Valenzuela calmed his men. Valenzuela and Lawton then teamed up and retreated down the mountains, where they waited for fresh American troops and scouts. On the other side of the mountains, Naiche and his band of 20 or so were continuing to ravage and plunder and kill in the countryside. At this time, the renegades had split into 3 parties, and all 3 were spreading death and destruction. But Lawton knew, and Valenzuela agreed, that the 3 would meet up eventually again in the Sierra Madre Mountains. They just needed to guess where. Lawton was undaunted, for now. He wrote his wife, quote, "Somebody must do something, and I am going to try and do it." End quote. By now, it was late June, and the bugs were horrendous, and the heat soared to 120 degrees and more during the day. The new scouts they used were ineffective, and the infantry lent to Lawton were mutinous and unreliable. Oh, when they had no officer, since their officer had been arrested during the journey south, and he was brought into camp in chains. And then the waiting was killing Lawton as well. But the Mexicans is what drove him crazy. He said Sonora was, quote, a God-forsaken country with God-forsaken people living in it, end quote. He even said, quote, the Indians are better than the Mexicans, end quote. Luckily for Lawton, on July 2nd, 1886, Assistant Surgeon Leonard Wood arrived at camp and lifted Lawton's spirits. Accompanying Wood was none other than Tom Horn, but only briefly. For he had been leading horses and mules down for Lawton, except on their way there. Horn didn't place any sentinels, and while everyone was asleep, the renegades in the dead of night stole all the horses. Lawton, once Horn arrived, was thoroughly unimpressed, and he sent Tom back north. Horn essentially ignores this in his autobiography. I mean, why not? He would end up milling about in Arizona until he settled at the San Bernardino Ranch in southern Arizona on the border with Mexico. He'll be back in the field shortly, though. Lawton, who really liked Wood, would put him in charge of the leaderless infantry. Lawton then got word that the Apaches were killing and on the move. What's new? So he and Wood and a commander named Brown left Valenzuela. For the next week or so, his whole unit followed the trail, which turned out to be 2 trails, which made him realize the renegades were about to meet up. But the trail was tough to follow in the monsoon season's rains of early July. Also, his Apache Scouts were near useless in the terrain. I mean, there was no trail to follow. And when they were following it, it was miserable. Lawton said the terrain was, quote, the worst mountains imaginable with the toughest kinds of canyons, end quote. He also said that it was so hot that the men were forced to march in their, quote, drawers and undershirts, end quote. On July 11th, he wrote in his journal, quote, everything seems to be going wrong, end quote. But he was still determined to be the one to do something. He also wrote on that day's entry, despite the hardships, quote, I have one good quality. I do not get discouraged and will never give up, end quote. Sounds like Geronimo. Then finally, on July 13th, Lawton got some good news from 2 Mexican Yaqui Indian scouts who had been lent to him by Valenzuela. They found the camp of the renegades about 8 miles south. Lawton immediately took pursuit. I'll let Sweeney describe the disappointment that happened next, though. Quote, hoping to gain positions well above their camp, the 27-year-old Brown, who would lead a brigade against the Germans in World War I, had already launched a flanking movement to the left. He planned to assault the village and drive the Indians towards Lawton's infantry. Lawton's force had just begun to approach the rancheria when he heard gunfire. His men rushed to the village and found it occupied by Brown's scouts, who had fired at ghosts. The Chiricahuas had escaped through the Canebrake Up River. Lawton was so disappointed as to be sick, for here was the chance we had been looking for so long, and it slipped from me without being able to do anything to prevent it. And all quotes. Want to know something, dear listener? I am as tired of the hostiles' constant escapes as you are hearing about them. I am as tired as Lawton and his men. And they were tired. They spent the next few weeks in this camp where they'd captured all of the loot from Naiche and Geronimo. And they had yet again teamed up. Lawton's men really needed the rest, too, for it turns out Wood had been bitten by a tarantula and was suffering severely from the wound that wouldn't heal. And here I thought tarantulas were harmless. Lawton himself would almost die from an illness during these weeks of rest in the rough and rugged Sierra Madres, which should be called the Smothering Mother Mountains. By early August, a few more men from New Mexico and Arizona, including 2 Apache Scouts, which again was a reversal of General Miles' previous plan for the war. But a few more men had joined Lawton's team, which included some scouts who were led by none other than Tom Horn. He was back in action. He had another chief of scouts with him named Daly. This is the same man who warned Maz that the Chiricahuas were going to flee. Horn's 2 Chiricahua Apache Scouts were named Keita and Martin. They were all led by a man named Lieutenant Charles Gatewood. I actually talked about Gatewood in one of my first episodes over the Buffalo Soldiers. He had participated in the hunt for Victoria. I guess I have talked about that, so I don't need to again. Lawton and his forces, though, were still bogged down in the Sierra Madres for some time. At one point, Horn would take some scouts and trek 75 miles through the mountains and across 2 difficult rivers in search of the renegades. Their search proved fruitless. On August 11th, Horn was out scouting when he and his comrades were shot at. The bullets hit so close that they were sprayed with dirt. Horn was later told it was the renegades' rear guard. They were right on their trail, but they rarely knew it. Horn wrote, quote, "It was a great race, and I knew the renegades could not stand it much longer." End quote. He was thankfully right. While Horn and Lawton were searching for the Chiricahuas, Geronimo and Naiche, you guessed it, were in Sonora slaughtering mules, raiding towns, and killing Mexicans and Americans. But in one battle on August 11th, the same day Horn got shot at, American miners got into a pitched firefight with the Apaches, which saw both Naiche and Geronimo get wounded. Naiche would later say that the American that shot he and his rifle had been quote-unquote very brave. But that American miner that shot him would end up dying. On August 15th, Geronimo told some Mexicans that he wanted to surrender. The Mexicans told the leader, the mayor, and then mayor told the governor of Sonora, the aforementioned Torres. But obviously, Geronimo had no plans to surrender to the Mexicans, although they were by now ready to surrender to the Americans. Horn had been right. They were exhausted. They missed their family. They were tired of running. So while the Apaches formulated a plan for surrender, they sent 2 women and 2 warriors into the town of Fronteras, a place I've talked about before. It used to be a presidio, and I believe it was built a couple hundred years before this for the sole purpose of fighting the Apaches. Geronimo sent 2 women into the old town, of course to buy some mezcal. The old medicine man was starting to dry up. Meanwhile, Torres, the governor, told his negotiator to tell Geronimo that they can come in, but they'll be relocated to a nice place where they'll be watched over. He meant a prison in Mexico City. If Geronimo refused, Torres told his man to wipe out the entire band. Over in the Sierra Madres on August 19th, Gatewood heard about the 2 women at Fronteras who had bought the mezcal. It was 2 a.m., but he was itching to end the war, just like all of us. Gatewood took his 6 soldiers, the 2 Apache Scouts, and Tom Horn, and they rode hard for Fronteras. By August 24th, Gatewood and his men were about 4 miles from Geronimo's camp in the Terras Mountains. I have not named these mountains, but quite a few shootouts have already occurred here. It was one of Geronimo's favorite hiding spots, and his camp was quoted as being on the steepest slope of the steepest mountain in Mexico. In Horn's autobiography, he claims this entire scenario I'm about to explain was all because of him, which is preposterous. so I will just be ignoring his telling of the end of the Apache Wars. But know that he was there for all subsequent meetings as an interpreter of Spanish to English or vice versa. The two Chiricahuas Scouts, Martin and Keita, and not Tom Horn, they were carrying a white flag, and eventually they reached Geronimo and his party. The Scouts would later claim they were never in any danger, but some of Geronimo's people later said Geronimo wanted to kill them both. But he was voted down by an exhausted Naiche. Once in camp, the Scouts told Geronimo and Naiche, quote, "You have no friends whatever in this world," end quote. And they went on to talk about the Americans, quote, "Their aim is to kill every one of you if it takes 50 years, end quote. Geronimo and Naiche heard the Scouts' words and told one of them, Martin, to go back to Gatewood and tell him, "We are ready to talk." On August 25th, Gatewood and Geronimo met in person. Gatewood told them to surrender or, quote, "fight it out to the end quote. But an important part of that message was that when you surrender, you will be sent to Florida forever. Geronimo said, "But we've always been allowed to go back to the res after hostilities." "Yeah, but look where that has led us." Then Gatewood gave him the gut punch when he said, "All of your Chiricahuas people, they've already been moved to Florida. There is no more reservation in Arizona for the Chiricahuas." By the way, this was news to the two Chiricahuas Scouts with Gatewood, but their reaction is not recorded. In reality, the Chiricahuas had actually not yet left for Florida, but Miles was working on that at this very moment, and it eventually would be accomplished. Geronimo then angrily said, quote, "Take us to the reservation or fight," end quote. But again, Naiche calmed Geronimo and eased Gatewood's fears by promising Gatewood that we would in fact not be fighting. After a tiring back and forth for both them and the reader, me, Gatewood wanted to go back to camp. He was done with it. But before he did, Geronimo asked him this, quote, "We want your advice. Consider yourself one of us and not a white man. Remember all that has been said today, and as an Apache, what would you advise us to do?" End quote. Gatewood responded with, quote, "I would trust General Miles and take him at his word." End quote. On the 26th, Geronimo and Naiche came to Gatewood's camp and surrendered. This time, they would not flee in the dead of night. They began their trek north, which was fraught with drunkenness. There was a Mexican army that threatened to kill the Apaches despite the Americans' presence. There was some intrigue. Miles told his man that if Geronimo refused to surrender, then each white man should kill the Apache nearest him. This man then rode down to the camp and told every white man this secret. Some were on board and wanted to do it right then and there. But obviously, it did not happen. Horn was absolutely told this, but he never mentioned it later in life. General Mills had become or will become a good friend, and this was an order told in secret. If it had come down to it, I believe Horn would have pulled the trigger. And it probably would have been aimed at Geronimo, or maybe Naiche. Miles did eventually go south, and on the 3rd of September he met with Geronimo and the hostiles. The interpreter turned to Geronimo and told him, "This is General Miles, and he is a friend." To which Geronimo responded with, quote, "I have been in need of friends. Why has he not been with me?" End quote. Geronimo would go on to tell Miles, quote, "This is the 4th time I have surrendered." End quote. to which General Miles responded with, quote, "And I think it is the last time." End quote. Naiche, the grandson of Mangus Coloradus, would surrender the following day. Mangus' band, who I haven't talked much about, they would surrender on October 18th, 1886. The Chiricahua would spend the next 27 miserable years as prisoners of war throughout the nation. But their first stop was Florida, to a fort built by the Spanish in 1695, which was around the same time the Apache were terrorizing the Puebloans after the Spanish had been kicked out of the Southwest. And with Mangus' surrender in October, the Apache Wars, a war which had begun with the kidnapping of Mickey Free and the cutting of the tent in 1861, had ended. But really, the war had begun long before that. It truly started the moment the Apache had arrived in the American Southwest, anywhere between 1200 and 1350. They arrived from the freezing north after losing a battle with their cousins, so I guess the war started even before that. Many of the Athabascans that would later become the Apache traveled down the Front Range, while others traveled on the western side of the Rockies. Eventually, they would run into the various peoples who already inhabited the area. Whether or not they fought against the Anasazi is unknown, but there's a good chance the Navajo branch of the Athabascans, who'd come down the western side of the Rockies from Canada and Alaska, there's a good chance they intermarried with the Puebloans, possibly prior to the Anasazi Civil War. Behind the Navajo were more Apaches who ran out the Mogollon and fought against the O'odham. The Apaches on the Great Plains fought with the Puebloans who had migrated from the Four Corners. They may have caused the settlements in the area to come together instead of being so spaced out. The Apaches fought against the remnants of the Anasazi in Mexico, a people known as the Raramuri or Tarahumara. The Apaches fought against the Humanos, who were once one of the largest tribes in terms of land in the Southwest and the Great Plains. Their empire stretched from Kansas and Colorado to northern Mexico to eastern Texas and western Arizona. They too may have been descendants of the Mogollons. The last time the Spanish mentioned the great Humanos, they termed them Humanos Apache, because if you can't beat them, join them. The Apaches would eventually hold the entire area the Humanos Empire once held. The Apaches fought against the Puebloans from their various mountain strongholds that filled the Southwest, and once the Spanish arrived, the Apaches fought them for hundreds of years. When the Comanche arrived, they fought the Comanche. They fought their cousins the Navajo. The Apache fought against the Ute. They raided the Hopis. They raided the Zunis, who gave the Apache their name, which means enemy. And for centuries, the Zuni used Apache scalps in their ceremonies. When Mexico gained her independence, the Apache fought the Mexicans. And once the Americans arrived, be it prospectors, beaver trappers, ranchers, Confederates, or Unionists, they fought the Americans. But as Crook famously put it to him, you can't stop what's coming. And we will never stop coming. For 1,000 years, the Apache fought everyone. But in 1886, their war was finally over. But it came at an enormous cost. In 1894, Geronimo and his people were transferred to Fort Sill, Oklahoma from Florida. It would be the closest he'd get to his homeland. But at least the Wichita Mountains are there. The people of Oklahoma, though, were not thrilled with his arrival. A local newspaper would write of him, quote, "Here we go to see the king of murderers and prince of fiery destruction, now made glorious by the sentimental adulation of insane freaks and misguided philanthropists. The old devil Geronimo should have been hung 15 years ago." End quote. In 1905, President Theodore Roosevelt would have Geronimo in his inaugural parade in D.C., during which time Geronimo asked him, quote, "I pray you to cut the ropes and make me free. Let me die in my own country, an old man who has been punished enough and is free." End quote. Roosevelt simply said, no. On February 17, 1909, Geronimo would die from pneumonia, which he contracted after he fell from his horse in a drunken daze, and he laid half submerged in a half-frozen creek overnight. In 1913, Washington allowed the remaining Apaches to return home to the Southwest, if they wished. Many stayed in Oklahoma. This was a difficult series to get through. One can only read about endless slaughter and murder so much before it gets to you. I tried to empathize with all sides, but sometimes it was tough. It was tough to empathize with the Mexicans because of how they acted. Tough to empathize with the Spanish, the Americans. But most of all, it was tough to empathize with the Apache. But I hope I did them justice. Thank y'all for listening, and I'll see you again soon in the American Southwest. This episode is graciously sponsored by one of my new favorite companies, the Buffalo Wool Co. Y'all know I have great love and respect for America's national mammal, the bison. My very first episode was over the wild and woolly beast, so when I tell you I discovered a company that makes 100% bison wool products, 100% in America, you know how excited I got. The Buffalo Wool Co. makes the most incredible and comfortable socks you've ever worn. Not only are the Buffalo Wool Co. socks comfortable, but they are warm. You can wear them in the house, to bed, or on a hike. I wore mine in the sands of Great Sand Dunes National Park, and I've worn my Buffalo Wool Co. socks while hunting in the northern forests of Wisconsin. I plan on wearing them for the rest of my life. Buffalo Wool Co. 100% guarantees you will love the product or your money back. The owners of Buffalo Wool Co. have been raising bison in North Texas for almost 30 years, and they're even more passionate about the amazing animals than I am. Buffalo Wool Co. not only makes socks, but also knit caps, gloves, scarves, and extremely warm and comfortable clothing for kids. My wife and I have a little one on the way, and I will absolutely be keeping our kids snug and warm with the Buffalo Wool Co.'s expanding brand. If you like being comfortable and warm and looking awesome while doing it, and if you support 100% made in America clothing, by people who are passionate about these animals and the ranchers who raise them, you will love the Buffalo Wool Co. Head over to their website, thebuffalowoolco.com, or my website, theamericansouthwest.com, where there will be a link on the home page. That's thebuffalowoolco.com.